Some discoveries do more than rewrite history. They unsettle the people who uncover them. Sealed chambers, enigmatic artifacts, unsettling remains, and impossible-looking structures have confronted archaeologists with evidence that refuses easy interpretation. What did their creators know that time erased? And why have certain findings remained fiercely debated for generations? Tonight, we follow the clues into archaeology's most disturbing revelations. So, sit back, relax, and let's begin. High above the Sahara, where the land hardens into stone and the horizon seems to dissolve beneath an immense sky, the Djado Plateau rises from the northeastern reaches of Niger. Here, the desert is not an empty expanse. Scattered across its rocky surfaces are the remnants of human occupation: mud brick structures, defensive walls, wells, pottery fragments, and traces of settlements that appear almost startling against the surrounding barrenness. The Djado Plateau is part of the wider Kawar region, an area shaped by ancient roots, isolated oases, and the movement of people across one of the most demanding environments on Earth. Today, the ruins can appear almost suspended in time. Their walls, weathered by centuries of wind and heat, suggest that communities once established themselves here with enough confidence to construct permanent settlements in a landscape that now seems remarkably inhospitable. But when did these settlements emerge? And why did people choose this difficult corner of the Sahara? The answer begins with the environment itself. The Sahara has never been completely static. Its climate has shifted repeatedly over thousands of years, transforming landscapes that are now arid into regions that could once support grasslands, wildlife, seasonal water sources, and human communities. Archaeological evidence from across the Sahara demonstrates that periods of greater humidity allowed populations to occupy areas that later became severely dry. Djado must therefore be viewed within this larger environmental story. The plateau lies near a chain of ancient and surviving oases where groundwater made human settlement possible. In a region where surface water is scarce, wells were not simply useful features. They were the foundation of survival. Whoever controlled access to reliable water could sustain people, animals, agriculture, and trade. And that may be one of the keys to understanding the ruins. Rather than imagining Djado as an isolated city appearing suddenly in the middle of nowhere, archaeologists generally understand the settlements of the region as part of a network of communities connected to wider Saharan movements. The surrounding landscape formed a difficult but navigable corridor between North Africa and the interior. Over time, caravans and travelers moved through these regions carrying commodities, ideas, technologies, and cultural traditions. Salt, livestock, dates, and other goods could move between oasis settlements and distant markets. The desert, paradoxically, could function not only as a barrier, but also as a highway. Yet, the physical remains of Djado raise questions that the broad historical picture cannot completely answer. Among the most striking features are the mud brick settlements and fortified-looking structures clustered around elevated areas. Their architecture reflects adaptation to a harsh climate, with thick walls providing protection from intense heat and helping create enclosed spaces suitable for habitation. Some structures appear almost fortress-like. Were they primarily defensive? Were they designed to protect valuable supplies? Or did their appearance result simply from the practical requirements of building within an exposed desert environment? Archaeology can provide possibilities, but the surviving evidence does not always provide certainty. The difficulty becomes even greater when trying to reconstruct the people themselves. The archaeological record of the Central Sahara contains traces of populations whose identities cannot always be matched neatly with historical names preserved in written sources. Later traditions, regional histories, and archaeological evidence sometimes overlap, but they do not form a complete narrative. This creates a peculiar silence. We can see where people lived. We can identify fragments of their material culture. We can examine the walls they constructed and the wells they depended upon. But the voices of the inhabitants themselves are largely absent. That silence has encouraged speculation about the origins and fate of communities associated with Djado. Some interpretations connect the region with the ancient Garamantes and other Saharan populations known from historical and archaeological research. The Garamantes, centered farther west in the Fezzan region of modern Libya, developed sophisticated oasis settlements and extensive systems for exploiting groundwater. Their history demonstrates something important. Ancient Saharan societies were capable of organizing complex communities in environments that modern observers might assume were impossible to inhabit permanently. But linking every mysterious Saharan ruin to the Garamantes would be an oversimplification. Djado belonged to a broader world of interacting peoples, and cultural influence could travel far beyond political boundaries. Similar architectural solutions can emerge independently in places facing similar environmental pressures. Then there is the question of abandonment. At some point, many settlements in the Djado region ceased to function as thriving communities. Their walls remained, but the people who built them moved on. Was the cause environmental change? Declining water availability, shifting trade routes, political instability, disease, or simply the gradual movement of populations toward places offering better opportunities? The most reasonable explanation may involve several factors acting together. A settlement dependent upon a fragile water system could become vulnerable if groundwater became harder to reach. A change in regional commerce could reduce the importance of an oasis. A community already facing environmental pressure might eventually decide that relocation was more practical than maintaining an increasingly difficult existence. Yet, abandonment is rarely a single moment. Cities do not necessarily disappear overnight. They can contract slowly. Families leave. Buildings are no longer repaired. Wells receive less attention. Trade becomes less frequent. Eventually, a settlement that once contained ordinary human activity becomes silent. At Djado, the desert preserved fragments of this process, and preservation itself creates another illusion. Standing among ancient ruins, it can seem as though the settlement was suddenly frozen at the moment its inhabitants disappeared. In reality, centuries of erosion, rebuilding, reuse, and collapse have altered the archaeological landscape. Walls may represent different periods of occupation. Structures may have been modified by successive communities. Objects may have traveled considerable distances before reaching the places where archaeologists eventually discover them. The ruins are therefore not a single snapshot. They are layers of human decisions. Perhaps the most compelling mystery of Djado is not whether an unknown civilization suddenly appeared here, but how ordinary people managed to transform such an unforgiving environment into a place capable of supporting life for generations. What knowledge did they possess about groundwater? How did they organize their settlements? Which routes connected them to distant communities? And how much of their history has simply disappeared because the materials that recorded it were never meant to survive thousands of years? The Sahara can be remarkably destructive. Organic materials decay, wind erodes exposed surfaces, and shifting sands can conceal archaeological evidence for centuries. A fragment of pottery may survive where an entire written record has vanished. Even the landscape itself can change. A location that once stood beside a useful water source may now appear completely disconnected from the ecological conditions that made settlement possible. To modern eyes, the ruins seem almost incompatible with their surroundings. But perhaps that is precisely what makes Djado so revealing. It reminds us that the Sahara we see today is only one chapter in a much longer environmental history. Somewhere among the stone, clay, collapsed walls, ancient wells, and buried traces may lie evidence capable of clarifying who lived here, how they survived, and why they eventually departed. For now, the plateau remains a place where archaeology can illuminate much, but not everything. The ruins offer evidence, yet important pieces of the story remain beyond reach. And perhaps beneath the wind-scoured ground, another fragment of that forgotten world is still waiting to be found. From the sun-baked plateau of Djado, where abandoned walls still preserve fragments of human ambition, the trail leads us toward another kind of ancient landscape. One shaped not by desert isolation, but by elevated ground, imposing earthworks, and communities that deliberately chose the high places. Across Britain and Ireland, thousands of hill forts occupy ridges, promontories, and summits, forming one of the most recognizable archaeological legacies of later prehistory. Yet, their purpose remains far more difficult to define than their massive ramparts might suggest. Seen from a distance, a hill fort can appear almost simple. A hill rises above the surrounding countryside. Around its summit, banks and ditches form sweeping lines through grass, woodland, or exposed earth. Some enclosures are modest, while others stretch across several hectares, their defenses arranged in multiple rings. What survives today may be only a fraction of what once stood there. Timber palisades have rotted. Stone walls have collapsed. Earthen banks have softened beneath centuries of weather. Yet the outline remains. And that outline immediately raises a familiar question. Why did prehistoric communities invest so much labor in shaping these elevated places? For generations, the most straightforward explanation was military. A hill fort was assumed to be a fortress, a place designed to protect people from attack. Its elevated position offered visibility, while steep slopes and artificial ramparts created formidable obstacles. From the summit, inhabitants could potentially observe movement across the surrounding landscape long before approaching groups reached the enclosure. Some archaeological evidence certainly supports defensive functions. Hill forts could possess substantial banks, ditches, controlled entrances, and carefully positioned approaches. At some sites, the arrangement of the defenses suggests that movement into the enclosure was deliberately restricted. The architecture itself could have made an important statement. This was a protected place, and entering it was not a casual act. But the fortress interpretation has never explained every hill fort. Some sites contain little evidence for permanent occupation. Others appear too large to have been designed merely as refuges for a small population. And in several cases, the interior contains traces of activity that suggest gathering, production, exchange, ceremony, or temporary occupation rather than continuous military residence. This has gradually changed the archaeological conversation. Perhaps a hill fort was not one thing. Perhaps its meaning shifted over time. A settlement could become a defensive stronghold when circumstances demanded it. A ceremonial gathering place could later acquire political importance. A center of exchange might eventually become a refuge during periods of instability. The architecture may have remained visible while the social meaning changed around it. This possibility becomes particularly intriguing when considering the sheer number of hill forts. Researchers estimate that there may be more than 4,000 hill forts across Britain and Ireland, although their forms, dates, and functions vary considerably. They are therefore not a single uniform monument type, but a broad category encompassing communities with different histories and purposes. What happened across this landscape that encouraged so many communities to construct imposing enclosures? The answer may lie partly in a period of profound social transformation. From roughly the first millennium BC onward, communities across parts of Britain and Ireland experienced changes in settlement patterns, agriculture, trade, social organization, and regional interaction. Hilltops offered practical advantages, but they also provided something less tangible: visibility. A settlement positioned above its surroundings could be seen, and being seen may have mattered. A large enclosure rising above a valley would have communicated effort, organization, and control. Its ramparts were not merely obstacles, they were visual statements. Imagine approaching one thousands of years ago. The slope rises ahead. The earthwork grows larger with every step. A ditch interrupts the path. Above it stands a timber or stone barrier. People are moving somewhere beyond the entrance. Smoke rises from fires. Animals are contained within enclosures. The sounds of work and conversation carry across the summit. Whether or not an attack was ever expected, the monument itself would have conveyed authority. This brings us to one of the more compelling interpretations of hill forts, that some may have been expressions of community identity. Instead of asking only, what were they defending against? Archaeologists increasingly consider another possibility. Who were they bringing together? A massive enclosure requires coordinated labor. Trees must be cut. Earth must be moved. Stone may need to be quarried and transported. Entrances must be constructed. Defensive lines must be maintained. Such work implies organization. It may have required cooperation between households or groups with shared interests. But cooperation does not necessarily mean equality. A monument capable of mobilizing hundreds or even thousands of people could also reflect emerging hierarchies. Who decided where the hill fort would be built? Who organized the labor? Who controlled the entrance? Who had access to the most protected areas? And who benefited from the authority represented by the monument? These questions become increasingly important because the interior of some hill forts does not resemble a simple military camp. Archaeologists have discovered evidence for domestic structures, craft activity, storage, food preparation, and other forms of daily life at various sites. At Kinver Edge, for example, archaeological interpretation suggests that roundhouses once occupied the interior, while the fort's position and ramparts offered both natural and constructed defenses. Yet, even there, the original inhabitants and precise purpose remain unanswered. This uncertainty is not a weakness of archaeology. It is part of the evidence. A ruined monument can tell us where people invested labor, but it cannot automatically tell us what they believed. And this is where the more speculative interpretations begin. Some have proposed that certain hill forts may have had ceremonial or ritual functions, perhaps serving as gathering places connected to seasonal events, communal feasting, or religious practices. Others have suggested that some could have functioned as elite centers where leaders displayed wealth and authority. Neither interpretation necessarily excludes the other. A place can be defensive and ceremonial, political and religious, residential and symbolic. Ancient societies did not divide their landscapes into neat, modern categories. A fortified summit could simultaneously protect a community, host a gathering, display social power, and serve as a place of ritual significance. Then there is an even deeper possibility. Perhaps the location itself mattered independently of the structures. Across many cultures, elevated places have carried symbolic importance. A summit provides perspective. It separates those who stand upon it from the landscape below. It creates a natural stage. Could some hill forts have been deliberately positioned to connect human activity with particular features of the surrounding environment? Ridges, rivers, valleys, distant peaks, the movement of the sun, the horizon itself. Such ideas require careful evidence, and archaeologists remain cautious about assigning astronomical or ritual meanings without supporting data. Yet, the possibility cannot always be dismissed simply because the original beliefs have disappeared. The greatest difficulty is that the people who constructed these monuments left no detailed written explanation. Their intentions must be reconstructed from earth, stone, pottery, animal remains, tools, settlement traces, and the geography itself. Even modern technology can reveal more questions than answers. Aerial photography, geophysical survey, and LiDAR can expose subtle earthworks that are almost invisible from ground level. Recent archaeological prospection has shown how remote sensing can identify previously unrecognized hill forts and other enclosures, demonstrating that even landscapes studied for generations may still contain features that escaped earlier investigation. This changes the scale of the mystery. What if the hill forts already known to us represent only part of the original network? What if smaller settlements once connected them into a much larger social landscape? What if some apparent gaps between major sites are not genuine gaps at all, but the result of archaeological evidence that remains buried beneath fields, forests, or modern development? The discovery of additional sites would not necessarily solve the mystery. It might make it larger. Because the more hill forts archaeologists identify, the more complicated their distribution becomes. Some occupy dramatic peaks. Others sit on relatively modest elevations. Some command enormous views. Others appear surprisingly tucked into the landscape. Some have monumental defenses. Others are comparatively understated. This variation suggests that there was no single blueprint for the hill fort tradition, and perhaps that is why the legacy has survived so powerfully. The monuments look similar enough to be grouped together, yet different enough to resist one universal explanation. A rampart may have been built to keep enemies out, or to keep livestock in. A gateway may have controlled movement, or created a ceremonial entrance. A summit may have housed families, or hosted gatherings, or both. The hill forts have shown us how ancient communities could transform elevated ground into places of defense, gathering, and authority. But as we move onward, the landscape becomes quieter, and the evidence more intimate. Instead of enormous ramparts dominating a horizon, we encounter a single mound, an artificial rise of earth whose very name hints at a disturbing possibility. Hostage Mound. The name immediately captures the imagination. It suggests captivity, conflict, and human lives caught between rival powers. Yet archaeology asks us to slow down before accepting the story implied by a name. Place names can preserve memories, traditions, or interpretations that emerged centuries after the monuments themselves were created. A title may point toward a genuine historical episode, or it may be a much later attempt to explain something people no longer understood. And that uncertainty is where the mystery begins. A mound is deceptively simple. From ground level, it may appear little more than a grassy elevation, its slopes softened by rain and vegetation. But beneath that surface can lie layers of construction, occupation, destruction, burial, and reuse. A mound can be a monument, a settlement remnant, a defensive feature, a burial place, or several of these things at different moments. Hostage Mound belongs to that wider archaeological problem. How do we reconstruct the purpose of a place when the people who created it left no explanation? The landscape surrounding such monuments is often more informative than the mound itself. Ancient builders rarely selected prominent locations at random. Elevation could provide visibility, drainage, and defensibility. A raised position could also make a settlement more conspicuous, transforming architecture into a public statement. But what did people see when they stood here centuries ago? Perhaps fields extended toward the horizon. Perhaps nearby settlements were visible from the summit. Perhaps roads or paths passed through the surrounding countryside. And perhaps the mound formed part of a much larger network, whose meaning has been fragmented by time. The most conventional archaeological approach begins with the physical evidence. Researchers examine the mound's shape, dimensions, construction materials, surrounding features, and relationship to nearby archaeological sites. Excavation, where possible, can reveal layers within the earth. Pottery can provide clues about chronology and cultural connections. Charcoal may allow radiocarbon dating. Animal bones can indicate diet or economic activity. Post holes may reveal structures that have completely disappeared above ground. Piece by piece, an ancient landscape begins to emerge. Yet, the name Hostage Mound introduces another possibility, the possibility that later communities associated the place with people who were held captive. This idea needs to be treated cautiously. There is a major difference between evidence for captivity and a tradition of captivity. A place name does not, by itself, demonstrate that hostages were ever held there. If archaeological evidence were to reveal confined spaces, unusual mortality patterns, weapons, restraints, or other indicators of violence and imprisonment, the interpretation could become stronger. Without such evidence, the name remains an intriguing clue rather than a conclusion. Still, the concept of hostages is not historically implausible. Across ancient societies, political hostages could serve as instruments of diplomacy. Powerful rulers sometimes demanded members of rival families as guarantees of loyalty. Hostages could be exchanged after conflicts, used to enforce treaties, or retained to discourage rebellion. In such circumstances, captivity was not always random imprisonment. It could be a political mechanism. A ruler might take the son of a neighboring leader, not because the child represented a military threat, but because his presence guaranteed his father's obedience. This raises an unsettling question. If a place really had been associated with hostages, would the archaeological evidence necessarily look different from an ordinary settlement? Perhaps not. A captive could eat the same food, sleep in the same kind of structure, wear locally produced clothing, use ordinary pottery, and if the captivity ended peacefully, there might be almost nothing physical left behind. The historical event could disappear completely, leaving only a memory embedded in a name. This is one reason archaeological mysteries can be so difficult. Human experiences are not always preserved materially. A political agreement may leave no object. A betrayal may leave no inscription. A prisoner may leave no recognizable trace. A decision made by a ruler can shape an entire community without producing anything archaeologists can confidently identify thousands of years later. The mound, therefore, becomes something more than an archaeological feature. It becomes a question about memory. How did later generations remember the places around them? And why did certain stories survive while others disappeared? Traditional names sometimes preserve fragments of forgotten events, but they can also be altered by language, folklore, religious interpretation, or simple misunderstanding. A later population encountering an ancient mound might have known that something unusual had happened there without knowing precisely what. Over generations, the explanation could become simplified. A burial mound becomes a king's grave. An abandoned fort becomes a castle. A prehistoric earthwork becomes the work of giants. A mysterious hill becomes a place associated with captives. The original reality may be far more complicated. This does not make the tradition worthless. On the contrary, it can provide a starting point for investigation, but archaeology must test the story against the physical evidence. That process can produce surprising results. Sometimes a traditional interpretation is supported by excavation. Sometimes it is contradicted, and sometimes the evidence refuses to choose. Hostage Mound invites precisely this kind of uncertainty. Its importance may not depend upon proving that prisoners were once confined there. The deeper significance could lie in understanding how communities organized themselves, how they responded to conflict, and how places acquired meanings that outlived the societies that created them. Consider the psychology of an elevated monument. A mound rises above ordinary ground. It can be seen from a distance. People approaching it are made aware of its presence before they reach it. That visibility could have practical value, but it could also carry symbolic power. Imagine a community gathering near such a place during a period of political tension. Messages arrive from a neighboring group. A treaty is negotiated. An agreement is reached. As part of that agreement, important individuals are handed over as guarantees. Where would they stay? Inside a fortified enclosure, within the residence of a local leader, at a specially controlled site? We cannot simply assign an answer. But the possibility reminds us that ancient landscapes were not merely collections of buildings. They were arenas of negotiation, fear, loyalty, exchange, and authority, and those forces could leave remarkably subtle traces. There is another possibility worth considering. Perhaps the name has nothing to do with literal hostages at all. It might refer to an event that later generations interpreted metaphorically. Perhaps people were said to be held by the Mound because they were trapped there during a conflict. Perhaps prisoners were associated with the wider region rather than the Mound itself. Perhaps the story emerged centuries after the original occupation. Such interpretations belong to the speculative edge of the investigation, but they demonstrate why names must be separated from evidence. The temptation to build a dramatic story around an evocative name is powerful. Archaeology demands patience instead. The earth does not usually reveal a complete narrative. It provides fragments, a piece of pottery, a damaged wall, a layer of ash, a buried floor, a human bone, a concentration of animal remains, a ditch that once surrounded a settlement. Individually, these clues can appear insignificant. Together, they may transform our understanding of a place, and sometimes, even after years of excavation, the central question remains unanswered. Who lived here? Why did they build it? What happened to them, and how did the place acquire a name that would survive long after its original inhabitants disappeared? There is also the possibility that what we see today represents only the final stage of a much longer history. Mounds can be reused. An earlier structure may be buried beneath a later one. A settlement can become a burial place. A defensive feature can be incorporated into a new community. Centuries later, another population may occupy the same ground without understanding the original purpose of what they inherited. In that sense, Hostage Mound may be less like a single monument and more like an archaeological palimpsest, a landscape repeatedly written upon, erased, and rewritten. The visible mound is only the latest surviving expression. Beneath it could be earlier activity that has yet to be fully understood. Perhaps there are traces of ordinary domestic life. Perhaps there are indications of conflict. Perhaps there are graves. Perhaps there are structures whose purpose remains uncertain. Or perhaps the most important evidence has already disappeared. That is the paradox of places like this. The name seems to promise a story. The landscape offers fragments. But the missing pieces are precisely the ones that would allow us to connect those fragments with certainty. And so the investigation remains open. From the uncertain memory preserved in Hostage Mound, our investigation now moves toward a very different landscape, an island of brilliant stone, wind, sea, and ancient religious power. In the center of the Cyclades, Delos rises from the Aegean as a place that once seemed far more important than its small size would suggest. Today, its ruined temples and weathered streets stand beneath an open sky, but the silence of the island conceals a remarkable history. For the ancient Greeks, Delos was no ordinary island. It was traditionally regarded as the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, and its sacred reputation made it one of the most important religious centers of the Aegean world. Pilgrims traveled across the sea to participate in festivals and honor the gods. Sanctuaries, monuments, treasuries, statues, and public buildings accumulated over generations, transforming the island into a dense religious and commercial center. Yet, the most intriguing aspect of Delos may not be what remains visible. It is what has disappeared. The island we encounter today is dominated by ruins. Marble columns lie broken among foundations. Sacred precincts are reduced to fragments. Statues have lost their original settings. Walls survive only in partial outlines. And somewhere within this enormous archaeological landscape were sanctuaries whose original forms, functions, and meanings remain only partly recoverable. What did these sacred places look like when worshippers filled them? What rituals took place inside? And how much of Delos's religious landscape has been permanently erased? The history of Delos stretches deep into antiquity. Archaeological evidence demonstrates occupation long before the island became the major sanctuary associated with Apollo. Over time, however, its religious significance expanded, and by the Archaic and Classical periods, Delos had become a major sacred destination. Its importance was closely connected with mythology. According to ancient tradition, Leto came to Delos while seeking a place to give birth to Apollo. The island, which had previously been described in myth as a wandering or floating land, became the birthplace of the god. Myth and archaeology cannot be treated as identical forms of evidence. Archaeologists can investigate buildings, artifacts, inscriptions, burials, and environmental remains. They cannot excavate a myth. But myths can reveal how later communities understood a place and why certain locations acquired extraordinary religious importance. At Delos, that connection between landscape and sacred identity became particularly powerful. The island was eventually regarded as so sacred that major restrictions were imposed upon activities considered incompatible with its religious character. One famous example involved burial. According to ancient accounts, burials and births were restricted within the sacred area, and later measures resulted in the removal of graves from the island. The reasons were religious, but the consequences were archaeological. Human remains and funerary objects could preserve information about ordinary populations, yet the deliberate relocation of burials means that part of Delos's ancient human landscape was physically displaced. Even sacred purity could alter the archaeological record. And then came political power. During the 5th century BC, Delos became closely connected with the Delian League, an alliance originally formed by Greek city-states against the Persian Empire. The island's sanctuary and its central position in the Aegean gave it immense political significance. At one point, the treasury of the League was transferred from Delos to Athens. The island itself, however, remained deeply important. Athens eventually asserted stronger control over Delos, and the island underwent major transformations. Sacred spaces were reorganized. Festivals and religious practices were regulated. The landscape itself became a reflection of political authority. This raises an important question. When we look at the ruins of Delos, are we seeing only a religious center, or are we also seeing the physical imprint of political competition? The answer appears to be both. Temples could express devotion, but they could also express wealth. Treasuries could hold offerings, but they could also demonstrate the prosperity and influence of the communities that built them. Monuments could honor gods while simultaneously displaying the power of human patrons. Delos therefore became a place where religion, commerce, and politics converged. Its sanctuaries were not isolated structures. They existed within a much larger urban environment. Residential quarters, marketplaces, workshops, roads, fountains, public buildings, and private houses surrounded the sacred precincts. Merchants and travelers moved through the island. Foreign communities established their own religious traditions. Evidence from Delos shows that people from different parts of the Mediterranean lived and worshipped there. This diversity makes the lost sanctuaries even more intriguing. Delos was not dedicated to one religious tradition in the narrow sense. Alongside the major Greek cults, archaeologists have identified evidence associated with Egyptian deities and other Eastern Mediterranean religious traditions. The island became a meeting point where different beliefs existed within the same urban environment. What happened when these traditions encountered one another? Did worshippers simply maintain separate sanctuaries? Did religious practices influence each other? Could certain architectural or artistic features reflect cultural exchange? Some evidence can be interpreted confidently. Other connections remain more difficult to establish, and the gaps become especially noticeable when considering sanctuaries that have not survived intact. Ancient sacred architecture was not necessarily permanent. Buildings were repaired, expanded, rebuilt, destroyed, abandoned. Sometimes a later structure incorporated an earlier one. Sometimes valuable materials were removed and reused elsewhere. Stone blocks could be dismantled and transported. Marble statues could be broken or relocated. Bronze objects could be melted down. Wooden structures could disappear almost completely. A sanctuary might therefore vanish physically while its memory survives in inscriptions, literary descriptions, or fragments scattered across the archaeological site. This creates one of Delos's most persistent mysteries. How many sacred spaces have we actually identified, and how many remain misunderstood because their architecture has been reduced to foundations? The island's archaeological remains are extensive, but the surviving ruins do not provide a perfect map of ancient religious life. Some sacred places can be identified through inscriptions or distinctive architectural features even when their original buildings are gone. Others may be harder to distinguish from ordinary structures. A small altar could once have been the center of a major cult. A modest enclosure could have held enormous religious significance. A building that looks insignificant today might once have been filled with offerings, incense, music, and pilgrims. This is where the imagination is tempted to go beyond the evidence. Some speculative interpretations have suggested that hidden chambers or undiscovered structures could still exist beneath portions of the island. Archaeological sites often contain layers that remain inaccessible because excavating everything would destroy the very evidence researchers are trying to preserve. At Delos, this problem is particularly important. The ruins themselves are fragile. Excavation is not simply a matter of removing soil until the past appears. Every layer removed is permanently altered. Modern archaeologists must therefore balance discovery with preservation. What lies beneath an unexcavated area may remain unknown for decades, and sometimes that uncertainty is preferable to destroying the context forever. There is also another kind of disappearance. The sacred landscape was transformed after the ancient religious system that sustained it declined. As political circumstances changed, the island's importance diminished. Its population contracted, monumental buildings fell into disrepair, and valuable materials were gradually reused or removed. Delos did not simply stop existing, it changed. The religious world that had given the island its extraordinary significance was no longer dominant, and the physical environment followed that transformation. Eventually, what had once been a major sacred center became an archaeological ruin. Yet, the island's mythology continued to echo through later centuries. This creates a striking contrast. The ancient pilgrims who traveled to Delos believed they were approaching a place connected directly with the gods. Modern visitors approach the same landscape carrying cameras, archaeological guides, and scientific questions. The stones are identical. The meanings are not. Perhaps that is the deepest mystery of the lost sanctuaries. A sanctuary is not simply a building. Its significance depends upon the people who recognize it as sacred. Remove the rituals, the prayers, the festivals, the offerings, and the stories, and even the greatest temple eventually becomes architecture. At Delos, archaeologists can reconstruct parts of the physical setting. From the windswept ruins of Delos, where sacred spaces once connected human lives with the world of the gods, our journey now moves far eastward, to the volcanic slopes of Java. Here, surrounded by forests and rising toward the summit of Mount Lawu, stands Candi Sukuh, a sanctuary unlike almost any other surviving monument in Indonesia. The first impression is unmistakable. Stone terraces climb the mountainside in successive levels, creating the appearance of a carefully arranged staircase leading upward. Weathered sculptures emerge from the masonry. Figures, animals, mythological scenes, and unusual symbolic forms appear among the ruins. At the highest point, the sanctuary opens toward the surrounding landscape, where clouds can gather around the mountain and the horizon stretches far beyond the ancient stones. Candi Sukuh does not resemble the great temples most people associate with Java. Its architecture is unusually compact, angular, and monumental. The central structure has often been compared to a truncated pyramid, while the arrangement of terraces creates a powerful sense of ascent. Why was this particular form chosen, and what did the people who built it believe they were creating? Candi Sukuh was constructed during the final centuries of the Majapahit period, generally dated to the 15th century AD. This was a time when political and religious life in Java was undergoing significant transformation. Hindu and Buddhist traditions had shaped the island for centuries, while local beliefs and older cultural practices continued to influence religious expression. The sanctuary therefore emerged from a complicated cultural environment. Its builders were not working within a single, isolated tradition. They inherited ideas from earlier Javanese religious architecture, mythology, ritual practices, and local sacred landscapes. The result was something distinctly its own. One of the most remarkable features is the temple's terraced design. Unlike a conventional enclosed temple, Candi Sukuh encourages movement upward. Visitors would have approached lower terraces before progressing toward higher levels. The architecture creates a physical journey, step by step, level by level, higher into the mountain. This may have carried practical and symbolic meaning. In many religious traditions, ascent can represent movement toward a sacred realm, purification, transformation, or proximity to the divine. But we should be cautious. Symbolic interpretations are tempting, especially when a monument has such an obvious vertical structure. Yet the original builders left no surviving explanation that tells us precisely what each terrace represented. The mountain itself may provide part of the answer. Mount Lawu was not merely a geographical landmark. Mountains have long held sacred significance in Javanese religious traditions, and high places could be associated with ancestors, divine beings, and spiritual forces. Constructing a sanctuary on the slopes of a major mountain may therefore have connected the monument to a much older conception of sacred geography. The temple was not simply placed on a mountain. The mountain may have been part of the temple's meaning. And then there are the sculptures. This is where Candi Sukuh becomes especially difficult to interpret. Some of its carvings depict scenes connected with Hindu mythology. Others contain imagery associated with fertility, sexuality, birth, death, purification, and transformation. Among the most discussed features are explicit anatomical representations. To modern observers, these sculptures can appear startling, but interpreting them through modern assumptions can be misleading. Sexual imagery in ancient religious art was not necessarily intended to provoke or entertain. It could symbolize fertility, creation, regeneration, the union of opposing forces, or the transition between different states of existence. At Candi Sukuh, such imagery may have formed part of a broader ritual system concerned with purification and renewal. One particularly important narrative associated with the temple is the story of Bhima, a powerful figure from the Mahabharata tradition. The Mahabharata had traveled far beyond its Indian origins and became deeply embedded in Southeast Asian cultures. In Java, its stories were adapted, transformed, and incorporated into local artistic and religious traditions. Candi Sukuh contains imagery that has been interpreted in relation to Bhima and other mythological figures. Yet, the exact meaning of the scenes remains debated. Were they intended to represent a specific episode from mythology? Did they communicate a symbolic lesson? Were they connected with rituals performed by visitors? Or did different images carry several meanings simultaneously? The absence of extensive written explanations leaves room for uncertainty. There is also the question of why Candi Sukuh looks so different from earlier monumental temples in Java. Some researchers have suggested that its unusual architecture reflects changing religious practices during the late Majapahit period. Others have proposed that the temple incorporates older indigenous traditions that remained powerful even after centuries of Hindu-Buddhist influence. This interpretation is particularly interesting because Candi Sukuh does not seem to simply imitate the grand temple architecture of earlier centuries. Instead, it appears deliberately different. The sanctuary's stepped form, mountain setting, unusual sculptures, and ritual imagery create a distinctive visual language. Could this reflect a religious transformation? Perhaps. The final centuries of Majapahit history were marked by significant political and cultural changes. New centers of power were emerging, and religious traditions were evolving. Temples built during this period sometimes display forms that differ substantially from earlier monuments. Candi Sukuh may therefore represent a late expression of an older religious world adapting to changing circumstances. But there is another possibility. Perhaps the sanctuary's apparent eccentricity is partly a result of our limited understanding. If we knew the rituals performed there, the architecture might seem far less mysterious. Imagine entering the first terrace with knowledge of every symbol. You would know where to stand, which sculpture mattered, which story was being represented, which path should be followed, which offerings belonged at each location. The monument would no longer appear strange. It would become a coherent ritual environment. But those instructions are gone. Archaeologists must reconstruct them from fragments. This is why the terraces are so fascinating. The physical structure survives better than the intellectual world that created it. Stone remembers shape. It does not automatically preserve meaning. There have also been more speculative interpretations of Candi Sukuh. Because of its unusual sculptures and distinctive design, some writers have suggested connections with prehistoric traditions, fertility cults, or even knowledge systems unrelated to mainstream Javanese religious history. Some fringe theories go further, proposing that certain features preserve remnants of much older civilizations or esoteric practices. There is currently no strong evidence requiring such explanations. The temple can be understood within the historical and religious environment of late Majapahit Java, while still containing elements whose precise purpose remains uncertain. That distinction matters. Mystery does not require abandoning the evidence. Sometimes, the most compelling mysteries are found precisely where the evidence ends, and Candi Sukuh provides several such boundaries. Why was this location chosen? Why was the sanctuary constructed in this particular form? Why do some sculptures emphasize themes that appear so different from those found at earlier Javanese monuments? And why did this style emerge during the final centuries of a major political and cultural era? One possible clue lies in the concept of purification. Some interpretations associate the sanctuary with rituals connected to cleansing, transition, and spiritual transformation. The journey through the terraces may have represented movement from one state toward another. If so, the temple was not simply a place where worshippers stood before a sacred image. It was a place they moved through. The physical journey could have formed part of the ritual itself. That would explain the importance of sequence. The lower levels prepare. The higher levels transform. The summit completes. But whether this interpretation accurately reflects the original ceremonies remains uncertain. The surrounding landscape adds another layer. From the higher terraces, the mountain environment becomes increasingly prominent. Clouds, forests, changing light, and distant peaks would have shaped the experience of anyone visiting the sanctuary. The builders did not construct Candi Sukuh in an empty landscape. They placed it within a living environment. The mountain may have been viewed as a sacred axis connecting different levels of existence. Such concepts appear in various forms across Southeast Asian religious traditions, although the exact beliefs held by the community at Candi Sukuh cannot simply be assumed. And then, at some point, the sanctuary ceased to function as it once had. Its rituals ended, its community disappeared or moved elsewhere. The political and religious landscape of Java changed. The stones remained. From the high terraces of Candi Sukuh, where stone structures still preserve fragments of a vanished ritual world, our journey now descends into a very different kind of archaeological mystery. In the green lowlands of El Salvador, beneath layers of volcanic earth, an ancient settlement was sealed so suddenly that ordinary life itself became part of the archaeological record. This is Joya de Cerén. At first glance, the site appears almost peaceful. Low earthen mounds rise among tropical vegetation, surrounded by the fertile landscape of the Zapatitan Valley. But beneath these quiet remains lies an extraordinary snapshot of a Maya farming community that existed roughly 1,400 years ago. Unlike monumental Maya centers dominated by enormous temples and royal monuments, Joya de Cerén was a village. There are no towering pyramids defining its skyline. No vast royal palace dominates the settlement. Instead, archaeologists uncovered homes, kitchens, storage areas, workshops, communal buildings, gardens, and everyday objects, evidence of people whose names and personal histories have largely disappeared. And then, sometime around the 6th century AD, something happened. The settlement was abandoned. But unlike many ancient villages, Joya de Cerén was not gradually dismantled. It was buried. The culprit was a volcano. Loma caldera erupted near the settlement, sending ash and volcanic material across the surrounding landscape. Layer after layer accumulated over the village, sealing buildings and objects beneath the deposits. The eruption appears to have happened rapidly enough that many structures remained remarkably well preserved. That single event transformed an ordinary farming community into one of the most valuable archaeological sites in the Americas. Because the volcanic material acted almost like a protective blanket, archaeologists were able to recover details that normally disappear within centuries. Wooden beams survived in mineralized form. Household tools remained in place. Food storage areas preserved traces of crops. Beds, grinding stones, ceramic vessels, and other objects remained associated with particular buildings. The result is extraordinary. At many ancient sites, archaeologists discover monuments after centuries of reuse and destruction. Objects may have been moved, buildings reconstructed, and valuable materials removed. At Joya de Cerén, the volcanic eruption interrupted that process. It effectively froze a moment. But this raises the most important question. What was that moment? And what happened immediately before the settlement disappeared? The evidence suggests that the inhabitants had little reason to expect their homes would soon be buried. The village was part of an agricultural landscape where people cultivated crops such as maize and other plants. Everyday activities took place in and around household compounds. Grinding stones indicate food preparation. Storage facilities reveal attempts to preserve agricultural products. Domestic structures provide clues about family life. There are even traces suggesting that people maintained gardens close to their homes. This is important because Joya de Cerén challenges the way ancient Maya civilization is often imagined. The Maya are frequently represented through monumental cities, elaborate temples, royal inscriptions, and astronomical achievements. But most people in ancient Maya society were not kings or priests. They were farmers, craftspeople, builders, traders, parents, and children. Joya de Cerén allows archaeology to move away from royal monuments and toward ordinary households. Here, the mystery is not simply what a civilization accomplished. It is what everyday life actually felt like. Imagine walking through the settlement shortly before the eruption. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Corn is being prepared. Tools are being used. People move between houses. Animals may be nearby. A family stores food for later. Someone leaves a ceramic vessel beside a wall expecting to return. And then the landscape changes. The first volcanic deposits begin to fall. Was the eruption immediately recognized as a catastrophic event? Or did the inhabitants initially believe it would pass? This remains difficult to establish. Volcanic eruptions can unfold in stages, and Loma Caldera's activity appears to have included multiple eruptive phases. The archaeological evidence suggests that people had enough time to leave the settlement, because human remains have not been discovered in the buried village in the way we might expect if everyone had been trapped inside. This detail changes the story. Joya de Cerén was buried, but it was probably not a mass death site. The inhabitants appear to have escaped, and that creates another mystery. If they survived, where did they go? Did they establish a new settlement nearby? Did they return after the eruption? Did volcanic activity make the area permanently unsuitable? Or did the community gradually disperse into other parts of the valley? The archaeological record provides fragments, but the fate of the people themselves remains less visible than the buildings they left behind. Perhaps they carried away what mattered most: tools, clothing, personal possessions, food, children, memories. What remained was what they could not or did not have time to take. That may explain why the site contains such a remarkable mixture of ordinary objects. Archaeologists have discovered items associated with food preparation, agriculture, weaving, craft production, and domestic life. These objects are valuable precisely because they were not deliberately placed there as offerings or monuments. They were simply being used, and then they were abandoned. This gives Joya de Cerén a quality almost impossible to obtain at other archaeological sites. It captures routine. The position of an object can reveal what someone was doing. The arrangement of a building can suggest how different spaces were used. The remains of crops can reveal what people ate and cultivated. Even architectural differences between households may reveal aspects of social organization. Yet, the settlement also contains features that continue to provoke questions. Some buildings appear to have had specialized functions. Communal structures suggest that people gathered for activities extending beyond individual households. The presence of ritual or ceremonial elements indicates that religious life was not separate from everyday existence. This is not surprising. Ancient communities did not necessarily divide their world into the categories we use today. Agriculture, religion, family, politics, and economics could overlap. A household could be a place of work and worship. A communal structure could have practical and ceremonial functions. A village could be part of a larger political and religious system, even without monumental architecture. Joya de Cerén therefore offers a rare opportunity to examine how those worlds interacted. But the volcano also introduces an uncomfortable question. Was the settlement's location itself unusual? The people were living in a volcanic landscape. The soil was fertile. Volcanic environments can provide excellent agricultural conditions, and the surrounding region offered resources that made settlement attractive. Yet, the same geological forces that enriched the soil could also destroy the communities that depended upon it. This tension is fundamental to Joya de Cerén. The volcano was both creator and destroyer. It helped shape the environment that supported agriculture. And eventually, it buried the village. Some speculative interpretations have imagined that the inhabitants may have interpreted the eruption through religious or supernatural beliefs, perhaps seeing the event as an act of divine power. Such ideas are difficult to prove. We know that Maya societies possessed complex religious traditions involving supernatural beings, sacred landscapes, celestial cycles, and powerful natural forces. But we cannot simply assume how the residents of Joya de Cerén interpreted this particular eruption. Did they believe their gods were angry? Did they recognize the eruption as a natural event? Did religious specialists attempt to explain what was happening? Or did survival simply become the only concern? The evidence remains silent, and that silence is valuable. It reminds us that archaeology should distinguish between what can be demonstrated and what can only be imagined. There is another fascinating possibility. Perhaps the settlement was abandoned not only because of the eruption itself, but because the event altered the surrounding landscape. Ash can destroy crops. Lava and volcanic deposits can block paths. Water systems can change. Fields can become unusable. Even if houses survive, the economic foundation of a village may not. The eruption, therefore, may have created consequences lasting far beyond the initial disaster. Yet, the remarkable preservation allows archaeologists to investigate the community in unusual detail. Buildings reveal social organization. Artifacts reveal technology. Plant remains reveal agriculture. Architecture reveals adaptation to the tropical environment. And the absence of human remains suggests that the villagers were able to evacuate. This makes Joya de Cerén different from archaeological sites associated with sudden mass mortality. The tragedy here is quieter. A community simply disappeared from the location. The people survived, perhaps carrying their possessions with them. But the place they called home was gone. Centuries passed. Vegetation covered the volcanic deposits. The village disappeared beneath the landscape. From the volcanic silence of Joya de Cerén, where an entire community was sealed beneath ash, our journey now moves back thousands of years to southern Iberia, where another ancient landscape preserves a very different kind of silence. Near the modern city of Valencina de la Concepción, in the province of Seville, a long stone passage disappears into the earth. At its entrance, enormous slabs form a structure that seems less like an ordinary tomb and more like a carefully constructed gateway into another world. This is the La Pastora Dolmen. Part of the remarkable prehistoric landscape of Valencina, La Pastora is a megalithic monument built during the Copper Age, generally dated to the 3rd millennium BC. Its architecture is striking. A long, narrow corridor constructed from large stone slabs leads toward a chamber at the far end. Unlike a simple burial pit, the monument was designed as a controlled journey into darkness. The deeper one goes, the less the outside world remains visible. Stone closes around the passage. Light becomes limited. The chamber waits at the end. Whoever designed it understood that entering this place was not an ordinary act. But what exactly happened inside? Was La Pastora primarily a burial monument? A sacred ceremonial space? A place where ancestors were honored? Or did its builders intend something more complex, something that combined death, memory, astronomy, and ritual? Archaeology can answer some of these questions. Others remain suspended between evidence and interpretation. The monument belongs to a period when communities across the Iberian Peninsula were constructing megalithic tombs on an impressive scale. These societies lived thousands of years before written history, yet they were capable of quarrying, transporting, positioning, and organizing enormous stones. That alone tells us something important. La Pastora was not the product of an isolated individual. Its construction required planning. People had to select suitable stone, transport it, prepare the ground, construct the passage, stabilize the chamber, and maintain the monument after completion. Such effort suggests that the structure held importance for the wider community, but importance does not necessarily mean that everyone had access to it. The narrow passage creates a sense of controlled movement. Perhaps only certain individuals were permitted to enter the deepest chamber. Perhaps ceremonies occurred at particular points within the monument. Perhaps the movement from daylight toward darkness represented a symbolic transition. We cannot know exactly. There are no surviving written instructions. No ancient guide explains what the builders intended. Instead, archaeologists must study the architecture itself. The passage is one of the monument's most revealing features. It is not merely a route to the chamber, it creates an experience. Outside, there is open sky. Inside, there is stone. The transition is gradual. The visitor crosses from one environment into another. For people living thousands of years ago, accustomed to landscapes illuminated by natural light, the sudden restriction of space and visibility may have been powerful. Was this deliberate? Almost certainly, at least in some sense. The builders chose to create an enclosed passage rather than placing the burial chamber directly on the surface. But what emotional or religious meaning they attached to that design remains uncertain. The most conventional interpretation is funerary. Megalithic monuments throughout Iberia were frequently associated with the dead, and excavations at comparable structures have revealed human remains and funerary offerings. The dead were not necessarily simply buried and forgotten. These monuments may have functioned as places where communities maintained relationships with their ancestors. A tomb could become a permanent point of reference within the landscape. Generations might return to it. New burials could be added. Objects could be deposited. Rituals could be repeated. In that sense, the monument could act as a bridge between living communities and those who had died. But La Pastora raises another question. Why construct such an elaborate passage? If the primary purpose was simply to bury the dead, a much simpler structure could have achieved that. Perhaps the journey mattered. Perhaps reaching the chamber was itself part of the ritual. This possibility becomes more intriguing when the wider landscape is considered. Valencina was not an isolated prehistoric monument. The surrounding region contains an extraordinary concentration of prehistoric remains, including settlements, craft areas, monumental tombs, and other megalithic structures. This suggests that the area was a major center of activity during the Copper Age. La Pastora therefore belonged to a much larger social landscape. People lived here. They worked. They exchanged goods. They buried their dead. They constructed monuments. And they transformed the landscape into a place filled with meanings that are now only partly visible. The scale of Valencina has led researchers to reconsider how complex prehistoric communities in Iberia could be. For a long time, prehistoric societies were sometimes imagined as small, scattered groups with limited organization. Sites such as Valencina complicate that picture. The evidence points toward communities capable of sustained labor, specialized production, long-distance exchange, and monumental construction. What kind of social structure made this possible? Were there powerful leaders, religious specialists, extended families, networks of cooperating communities? Perhaps several forms of authority existed simultaneously. The monument itself may have been a tool for expressing that authority. A structure requiring enormous collective effort could demonstrate that its builders possessed both resources and social organization. But La Pastora was not simply impressive. It was carefully oriented. This has attracted considerable attention. The passage and entrance have been studied in relation to the movement of sunlight, particularly around specific times of the year. Astronomical interpretations have suggested that light may have entered the monument in ways connected with seasonal cycles. Such possibilities are fascinating, but they require caution. Ancient builders certainly observed the sky. Agricultural societies depended upon seasonal rhythms, and celestial movements could have been important for measuring time. But proving that a particular alignment was intentional is difficult. A monument can face a particular direction for many reasons. Topography matters. Construction constraints matter. The availability of stone matters. And sometimes an apparent astronomical alignment can emerge by chance. Still, if sunlight was deliberately incorporated into the monument's design, the implications would be profound. Imagine entering La Pastora at a particular time of year. The passage is dark. The chamber lies ahead. Then, for a brief period, sunlight reaches into the interior. A beam of natural light crosses the stone. For the people who witnessed it, such an event could have carried enormous symbolic meaning. Was it a representation of renewal, a connection between the living and the dead, a marker of seasonal transition, or simply a practical consequence of the monument's orientation? The evidence does not allow us to choose confidently. And this uncertainty is exactly where more speculative interpretations have emerged. Some writers have suggested that megalithic monuments across Europe encode sophisticated astronomical knowledge or represent deliberate attempts to create symbolic connections between the heavens, the earth, and the dead. Others have proposed that certain monuments were designed according to complex geometric principles whose significance has been largely forgotten. There is little reason to assume that prehistoric builders lacked intelligence or observational skill. But there is equally little reason to attribute every unusual measurement to hidden knowledge. The truth may lie somewhere between these extremes. The builders of La Pastora may have possessed practical astronomical awareness without creating an elaborate mathematical system. They may have understood the seasonal movement of the sun through generations of observation. Their knowledge did not need to be written in books to be real. It could have been transmitted through tradition, through memory, through repeated experience, and perhaps through ritual. The title, Guardian Dolmen, introduces another layer of modern interpretation. A guardian suggests protection. But what exactly was being protected? The living? The dead? Sacred objects? A boundary between different realms? There is no evidence that the prehistoric builders themselves used such a concept in the modern sense. The monument may have appeared guardian-like to later observers because of its imposing entrance and subterranean character. Yet, the metaphor is strangely appropriate. The passage seems to guard something. At its deepest point lies a chamber hidden from ordinary view. Whatever was placed there was deliberately separated from the surface world. That separation may have been the central purpose. Perhaps the chamber was not intended for constant access. Perhaps entering it was rare. The darkness itself may have mattered. In a world without electric light, darkness was not simply the absence of illumination. It was an environment, a physical transformation, a place where ordinary perception changed. Moving underground could have represented movement into the realm of ancestors. But again, this remains an interpretation. The physical evidence cannot tell us what people believed with certainty. And then there is the question of what happened to the monument after its original use. Did rituals continue for generations? From the shadowed passage of La Pastora, where ancient builders carried their dead into carefully constructed chambers beneath the earth, our journey now moves eastward along the Mediterranean coast to a landscape where the dead were placed in a very different kind of monument. Carved directly into cliffs above the ancient city of Myra, the tombs of Lycia appear almost impossible at first sight. Stone facades resembling houses, temples, and elaborate residences suspended high above the valley. The cliffs are covered with them. Some stand alone. Others form dense clusters of carved chambers overlooking the ancient landscape. Their entrances are framed by architectural details that imitate structures built for the living: columns, beams, doors, roof lines, and decorative panels. Yet these are not houses. They are tombs, and their elevated positions seem deliberate. Why did the Lycians place their dead so prominently above the city? What did they believe happened to a person after death? And how many tombs once existed here before centuries of erosion, reuse, looting, and destruction reduced the original funerary landscape to what survives today? Myra was one of the most important cities of ancient Lycia, a region occupying much of what is now southwestern Anatolia. The city flourished for centuries, particularly during the classical and Hellenistic periods, and later became an important center within the Roman world. Its surroundings preserve an extraordinary mixture of archaeological remains. The ancient city itself contained monumental architecture. Nearby cliffs contain rock-cut tombs, and later Christian structures reveal another chapter of Myra's history, most famously associated with Nicholas of Myra, the 4th century bishop whose life eventually contributed to the traditions surrounding St. Nicholas. But long before Christian memory transformed the city's identity, Myra belonged to the Lycian world. The Lycians possess distinctive artistic and funerary traditions. Their tombs are among the clearest expressions of that identity. Rather than hiding the dead underground, many Lycian communities placed tombs in visible locations. Some were carved high into cliffs. Others took the form of monumental sarcophagi. Still others were built as elaborate freestanding structures. The result was a landscape where death remained physically present. The dead looked out over the living. That is one of the first mysteries. Was visibility itself part of the ritual? Perhaps. A tomb positioned high above a settlement would have been difficult to ignore. It could preserve the memory of an individual or family for generations. Anyone approaching the city could see the monuments. In a society where status mattered, funerary architecture could communicate wealth, ancestry, and political importance. The tomb was not merely a container for human remains. It was a public statement. This person existed, this family mattered, this lineage belonged here. Yet, the exact beliefs behind the tombs are more difficult to reconstruct. The Lycians were influenced by neighboring cultures while maintaining distinctive traditions of their own. Greek influence became increasingly important, particularly during the classical and Hellenistic periods, but Lycian language and cultural identity survived for centuries. Their funerary monuments therefore reflect a mixture of traditions. The facades sometimes imitate wooden houses. Others resemble temples. Some have reliefs depicting human figures, animals, weapons, or mythological scenes. Why imitate a house for the dead? One possibility is straightforward. The tomb represented a permanent dwelling. The dead were symbolically given a home. This interpretation appears plausible, but it cannot explain every architectural detail. A house contains doors. A tomb can contain a false door. A house protects living occupants. A tomb protects the remains of the dead. The architectural language is familiar, but its purpose has been transformed. Perhaps the builders wanted the tomb to function as a symbolic residence, or perhaps the resemblance carried a deeper cultural meaning that is now lost. The cliff itself may also have been significant. Carving a chamber directly into rock was labor-intensive. Workers needed to cut through hard stone using tools far less sophisticated than those available today. Yet, they created carefully proportioned chambers and elaborate facades. The work suggests planning and specialized craftsmanship. Someone had to finance it. Someone had to organize the labor. Someone had to decide where the tomb should be placed. And someone had to determine how the dead would be represented. This introduces another question. Who were these people? The surviving monuments often provide clues through inscriptions, artistic details, or associated archaeological evidence. But many tombs are damaged or have lost the information that once identified their occupants. Some were probably built for elite individuals or families. Others may have been reused. Later occupants could alter existing tombs, disturb earlier burials, or add new inscriptions. This creates another layer of uncertainty. When archaeologists encounter a damaged tomb today, are they looking at the monument in its original form, or at the accumulated remains of centuries of changing funerary practices? The answer is not always obvious. The ancient world rarely remained still. Tombs were revisited. Bodies could be moved. Offerings could be replaced. Doors could be opened and closed. New generations could inherit old monuments. Eventually, however, many tombs were abandoned. That does not necessarily mean they were forgotten. A monument can survive even when its original ritual function ends. Its meaning can change. A later population might see an ancient tomb as part of the landscape without understanding who built it. Legends can emerge. Names can change. Stories can become attached to monuments whose original inscriptions have disappeared. This is where the idea of the lost tombs becomes particularly intriguing. The surviving cliffs show us only part of Myra's ancient funerary landscape. Some tombs have been damaged by erosion. Others may have collapsed. Some were robbed in antiquity. Others were reused. And archaeological remains can disappear beneath later development, sediment, vegetation, or landslides. How many funerary monuments once existed that are no longer recognizable? We cannot know with certainty. The ancient landscape was probably far denser than the surviving monuments suggest. And even among known tombs, the contents may have been disturbed long before modern archaeology arrived. This matters because burial contexts are among the most informative archaeological records. A tomb can reveal age and sex through human remains. Objects can indicate social status. Food remains can provide clues about ritual practices. Textiles can reveal technology. Inscriptions can identify individuals and relationships. But once a tomb has been looted or repeatedly disturbed, much of that information disappears. The mystery is therefore not only about what is missing, it is about what was removed. Treasure hunting has affected ancient tombs across the Mediterranean for centuries. Valuable objects were attractive targets, particularly when tombs were believed to contain precious metals, jewelry, weapons, or other offerings. But there may be another reason some Lycian tombs appear strangely empty. Funerary practices themselves changed. A tomb could be opened and reused by descendants. Objects might be removed intentionally. Human remains could be rearranged. A later community might treat an earlier burial space differently from the people who originally created it. This makes the archaeological record difficult to interpret. And yet the architecture remains remarkably expressive. The tombs were not built simply to disappear. They were designed to be seen. This is particularly striking at Myra, where cliffs transform the dead into permanent elements of the urban landscape. Imagine the city during its height. Below, streets filled with movement. Merchants, farmers, officials, travelers, and worshippers passing through the settlement. Above them, carved into the cliffs, the tombs remained silent. A visitor arriving from the surrounding countryside would have encountered these monuments before reaching the center of the city. The dead were part of the visual identity of Myra. Perhaps this was deliberate remembrance. Perhaps the tombs served as statements of ancestry. Perhaps they reinforced the authority of families whose influence extended across generations. Or perhaps the cliffs were considered sacred spaces in their own right. There is evidence that ancient societies frequently associated elevated places with religious significance, but assigning a specific sacred meaning to the Lycian cliffs requires caution. The monuments tell us that the dead were placed there. They do not automatically tell us why the location was spiritually important. This distinction becomes even more significant when considering later traditions. Myra eventually became a major Christian center. The city's later religious identity became closely associated with Nicholas, whose reputation eventually spread far beyond Lycia. But the Christian landscape developed above and around an older world. Ancient pagan tombs did not suddenly disappear when Christianity emerged. They remained physically present. Their meanings, however, could change. A landscape once shaped by Lycian funerary traditions became part of a Christian city. The same cliffs witnessed different religious worlds. From the cliff tombs of Myra, where ancient stone preserved the memory of the dead high above the city, our journey now returns to the windswept heights of northern Britain. Here, on an isolated hill in Aberdeenshire, the remains of a fortified settlement cling to the summit of Dunnideer Hill. Broken stone walls, earthworks, and scattered traces of occupation occupy a landscape shaped by wind, rain, and centuries of silence. At first, Dunnideer appears modest. There is no vast monumental gateway, no towering stone temple, no perfectly preserved fortress rising above the surrounding countryside. Instead, the summit holds fragments, enough to reveal that this was once a place of defense and occupation, but not enough to tell us exactly how it functioned. And that uncertainty is what makes Dunnideer so compelling. The hill rises prominently above the surrounding landscape, giving anyone standing at its summit an expansive view across the countryside. Such visibility would have been valuable to people living in a period when movement could be observed only from natural high points or constructed lookout positions. But was Dunnideer chosen primarily because it was defensible? Or was the view itself part of the reason? Perhaps both. Dunnideer Hill contains the remains of a prehistoric hill fort, with later occupation associated with the Pictish period. The site is particularly notable because the summit preserves traces of multiple phases of fortification, suggesting that the hill was not simply occupied once and abandoned. It was used, altered, and perhaps reinterpreted by different communities. That alone changes the story. When we look at the surviving walls, we may not be looking at a single fortress. We may be looking at layers of decisions made by people separated by generations. One community builds defenses, another repairs them. A later group occupies the same summit and changes its character. Eventually, the stronghold falls out of use. The stones remain. The people do not. The earliest occupation of the hill belongs to prehistoric Scotland, when communities across northern Britain were constructing defended settlements on prominent elevations. These sites varied enormously in size and design. Some were modest enclosures. Others were substantial fortified centers. Some may have been permanently occupied. Others may have served as refuges, gathering places, or elite residences. This variation makes the term hill fort useful, but imperfect. A modern word can make different ancient places sound as though they served exactly the same purpose. They did not. At Dunnideer, the natural shape of the hill provided an important part of the defense. Steep slopes could discourage attackers. The summit offered visibility. Stone could be gathered locally, and a fortified enclosure could turn an already advantageous location into a much more secure settlement. Yet defense may have been only one element. A stronghold, visible from a wide area, could also communicate authority. Imagine approaching the region in antiquity. The hill rises above the surrounding terrain. Its summit is occupied. Smoke rises from within the enclosure. People are moving along the slopes. The walls are visible from a distance. Even without confronting anyone, the settlement announces itself. Someone controls this place. Someone has invested labor here. Someone expects others to recognize its presence. This symbolic dimension becomes particularly important when considering the later history of Dunnideer. The site has been associated with Pictish occupation, and Pictish Scotland remains one of the most intriguing chapters of Northern European archaeology. The Picts left inscriptions, carved stones, settlements, and artifacts, but they did not leave behind the kind of extensive written historical record that would allow us to reconstruct their society in detail. Much of what we know comes from archaeology and from accounts written by neighboring peoples. That creates an uneven historical record. We can identify patterns, we can reconstruct landscapes, we can examine artifacts, but the Picts rarely speak to us directly in their own surviving words. Dunnideer therefore becomes part of a larger puzzle. Who occupied the Stronghold? Was it a local center of power, a defensive position, a residence for an elite family, a place used during periods of conflict, or did its importance change depending on the political circumstances of the time? There may never have been one answer. Ancient strongholds could perform several functions simultaneously. A leader could live there. Followers could gather there. Food and valuable goods could be stored within the enclosure. The site could provide protection during conflict. Ceremonies could take place there. Political decisions could be made there. The walls may have protected more than people. They may have protected authority itself. The physical remains at Dunnideer also reveal something about the challenges of reconstructing ancient architecture. Most hill forts do not survive in the form their builders intended. Timber structures decay. Wooden gates disappear. Roofs collapse. Earthworks erode. Stone walls are robbed for later construction. Vegetation gradually covers the remains. What appears today as a low bank or scattered stones may once have been a much more substantial structure. This is especially important at a site exposed to the weather. Dunnideer Hill has endured generations of wind and rain. The name itself evokes the exposed nature of the summit. Over centuries, natural erosion gradually reduces architectural detail. A wall that once stood high enough to dominate the summit may now survive only as a broken line of stones. A gateway may be difficult to recognize. A house may survive only through foundations. The archaeological landscape becomes a puzzle with many missing pieces. Yet there is another clue. The hill's location provides an extraordinary view. From an elevated stronghold, inhabitants could monitor movement across the surrounding countryside. In a world without modern communications, visibility had enormous strategic value. Smoke could signal activity. Approaching groups could be spotted. Livestock could be monitored. Routes through the landscape could be observed. But perhaps the most important advantage was simply knowing what was happening beyond the settlement. The ability to see farther could translate into the ability to react sooner. This conventional explanation is convincing, but it may not explain why particular hills became important in the first place. Were these locations already meaningful before fortifications appeared? Did earlier communities gather here? Were elevated places associated with ancestors, spirits, or sacred landscapes? The archaeological evidence does not provide a simple answer. Across prehistoric Britain, elevated locations sometimes contain evidence of earlier activity predating the fortifications themselves. In some cases, later communities deliberately built upon older sites. This raises the possibility that Dunnideer was not selected solely for military reasons. Perhaps the hill already mattered. Perhaps its prominence gave it a cultural identity long before the walls were constructed. This is where the mystery becomes more subtle. A fortress can be explained by warfare. A settlement can be explained by agriculture. But a location that continues to attract different communities across centuries may suggest something more complicated. Perhaps the hill became important because of its visibility. Perhaps because of its strategic position. Perhaps because it was associated with earlier traditions. Or perhaps all three factors reinforced one another. There are also stories and traditions associated with ancient Scottish strongholds that have emerged long after their original occupation. Later communities often encountered prehistoric or early medieval ruins without knowing exactly who built them. Stories developed to explain them. Kings became associated with ancient walls. Battles became attached to unnamed fortifications. Legends filled the gaps left by archaeological uncertainty. Such traditions can be culturally valuable, but they must be separated from physical evidence. A story can preserve a memory. It can also be created centuries after the event it supposedly describes. At Dunnideer, the distinction between archaeological fact and later interpretation is especially important because the site belongs to a period whose history remains incompletely understood. The picts themselves are surrounded by unanswered questions. Where exactly were their political centers? How centralized was their society? How did local communities relate to powerful rulers? How did their religious beliefs change over time? And what happened inside their fortified settlements during periods of peace? The walls cannot answer all of these questions, but they can tell us that organized communities existed. They can show that labor was mobilized. They can reveal that certain locations mattered enough to defend. And perhaps they can reveal something about the psychology of the people who built them. There is a striking human instinct behind a hill fort. Choose high ground. Look outward. Create boundaries. Control access. Protect what matters. These decisions are understandable even thousands of years later, yet the reasons behind them can remain invisible. Were the people of Dunnideer preparing for a specific threat? Or was the fortification itself part of maintaining status? A stronghold can deter conflict simply by existing. The walls do not need to withstand an attack if their presence prevents one. From the wind-carved summit of Dunnideer Hill, where broken walls still mark a place shaped by defense and authority, our journey now moves into the remote mountains of southern Peru. Here, the landscape changes dramatically. Towering ridges rise above deep valleys, mist gathers over dense vegetation, and narrow paths disappear into terrain that once offered refuge to the last independent rulers of the Inca world. Somewhere within this rugged region lies the memory of Vilcabamba. The name itself became one of archaeology's most persistent mysteries. For decades, explorers searched for the city where the surviving Inca state continued its resistance against Spanish rule. After the fall of Cusco, Manco Inca retreated into the mountains and established a smaller Neo-Inca state. Its rulers maintained independence for decades, until the Spanish finally conquered Vilcabamba in 1572. But the problem was simple. Where exactly was Vilcabamba? The mountains offered no easy answer. Dense vegetation concealed structures. Rivers cut through steep valleys. Ancient pathways vanished beneath forest growth. And Spanish accounts, although valuable, did not provide a straightforward archaeological map. The result was a legend that attracted explorers for generations. One of the most famous episodes came in 1911, when Hiram Bingham traveled through the Andes searching for the last Inca refuge. He encountered Machu Picchu and initially believed he had found Vilcabamba. Later, research demonstrated that Machu Picchu was not the final Neo-Inca capital, but the mistaken identification helped create one of the most enduring archaeological stories of the 20th century. Yet, the real Vilcabamba was not a fantasy. It existed. Spanish forces eventually reached it. Its final ruler, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed in 1572. The mystery concerns the landscape that survived afterward. What happened to the buildings? Which structures belonged to the final Inca state? Which ruins were older? And how much of the settlement still lies concealed beneath vegetation and soil? This is where the broader Vilcabamba archaeological landscape becomes particularly fascinating. The region contains numerous stone complexes, agricultural terraces, pathways, ceremonial spaces, and settlements scattered across difficult terrain. Some are associated with the Inca period, while others preserve evidence of earlier occupation. The mountains themselves become part of the archaeological problem. A site does not exist in isolation here. A stone building may connect to a terrace may connect to a trail may lead toward another settlement. A water channel may reveal how an entire community adapted to its environment. The landscape becomes a network rather than a collection of ruins. And among the most intriguing elements are the stone constructions themselves. Inca builders were capable of remarkable masonry. They could shape stones with great precision, fit blocks tightly together, and integrate architecture with steep mountain terrain. But the remote settlements of Vilcabamba do not always display the monumental character associated with Cusco or Machu Picchu. That difference may be meaningful. The final Inca state was not building under the same conditions as the empire at its height. Its rulers were operating under pressure. They had lost much of their territory. They were surrounded by hostile forces. They needed defensible locations and access to food, water, and communication routes. The architecture of survival could therefore look different from the architecture of imperial display. A settlement hidden within mountains did not need to impress an empire. It needed to endure. This may help explain why the Vilcabamba region is so difficult to interpret. Some structures could have served residential purposes. Others may have been agricultural. Others ceremonial. Still others may have had military or administrative functions. The boundaries between these categories are not always clear. A building used by an elite family could also function as a political meeting place. A ceremonial location could also mark an important route. A fortified position could protect agricultural resources. Ancient settlements rarely followed modern architectural categories. And then there is the question of the stone itself. Why build in such remote locations? One conventional explanation is strategic geography. The mountains offered natural protection. Steep slopes restricted movement. Dense forests made large-scale military operations difficult. Narrow passes could be monitored. High ridges provided views across valleys. The same features that make the region challenging for modern travelers would have made it an effective refuge for a political community under pressure. But geography alone may not explain the cultural importance of these locations. The Inca understood mountains not simply as physical obstacles. Mountains could hold profound religious significance. Certain peaks were regarded as sacred beings or powerful entities, and the surrounding landscape could be organized according to relationships between mountains, water, settlements, and celestial events. This means that a stone complex in Vilcabamba might have had practical and sacred dimensions simultaneously. Its location could be strategically useful because it was also religiously meaningful. Its water source could sustain inhabitants while also carrying ritual importance. Its orientation could serve practical purposes while reflecting a sacred conception of space. The modern observer sees stone. The ancient inhabitant may have seen a living landscape. That difference is crucial. It also explains why some interpretations of Vilcabamba have moved beyond conventional archaeology. Over the years, explorers and writers have proposed that hidden settlements in the region may contain secret chambers, undiscovered royal residences, or structures deliberately concealed from outsiders. Some theories suggest that the final Inca rulers may have hidden valuable objects before the Spanish arrived. Others imagine that undiscovered ceremonial spaces could remain beneath the forest. These possibilities cannot simply be accepted because the terrain is remote. There is no guarantee that dramatic discoveries remain hidden in every unexplored valley. Yet, the region is genuinely difficult to investigate. Dense vegetation can conceal low walls. Landslides can bury structures. Roots can disrupt archaeological layers. Steep terrain can make systematic excavation extremely difficult. Even identifying the boundaries of a settlement may require modern survey technologies. So, when we speak of lost structures in Vilcabamba, the word does not necessarily imply a legendary city waiting intact beneath the jungle. Sometimes, a lost site is simply one whose remains have become difficult to recognize. A wall collapses. Plants grow over it. Soil accumulates. The stones become part of the mountain. Centuries later, the settlement appears to have vanished. But the most important mystery may concern the relationship between the known ruins and the final Neo-Inca state. Spanish chroniclers described Vilcabamba as a functioning political center. There were rulers, there were soldiers, there were agricultural resources, there were religious practices, there were settlements and roads connecting different parts of the territory. Yet, archaeological evidence from the region can be difficult to connect directly with individual events described in colonial accounts. This creates a gap between written history and physical remains. A chronicler may describe a royal residence. Archaeologists may discover a stone structure. But how can we prove that they are the same place? A building may fit the description. Its location may appear plausible. Its date may be appropriate. But certainty requires multiple lines of evidence. This was one of the difficulties that surrounded the search for Vilcabamba. The landscape offered possibilities, but possibilities were not enough. Machu Picchu provides a powerful example. Bingham's initial interpretation seemed convincing to him, particularly because he was searching for a lost Inca refuge and encountered an extraordinary mountain settlement. But later, evidence demonstrated that the identification was incorrect. Even his interpretation of the skeletal remains at Machu Picchu was eventually overturned by modern analysis. The lesson is important. A spectacular ruin can encourage a spectacular explanation, but archaeology advances by testing those explanations. The real Vilcabamba was eventually identified elsewhere, and the distinction between the famous mountain citadel and the final Neo-Inca capital became clearer. Still, uncertainty remains across the wider region. Perhaps that is because Vilcabamba was never a single, isolated complex. It may have consisted of multiple settlements functioning together: a political center, agricultural terraces, military positions, religious sites, storage facilities, roads, water systems, and smaller communities supporting the whole structure. If so, searching for the lost city may create the wrong expectation. The final Inca state could have been a landscape of interconnected places rather than a single monumental city. This possibility changes how we interpret the stone complexes. A small structure might appear insignificant when viewed alone. But if it controlled a route between two settlements, its importance becomes much greater. A terrace may seem ordinary until its scale reveals that it supported a substantial population. A ceremonial platform may seem isolated until its alignment with mountains and pathways becomes clear. Archaeology is therefore increasingly concerned not only with monuments, but with relationships. Where did people live? How did they move? Where did food come from? How was water distributed? From the wind-carved summit of Dunnideer Hill, where broken walls still mark a place shaped by defense and authority, our journey now moves into the remote mountains of southern Peru. Here, the landscape changes dramatically. Towering ridges rise above deep valleys, mist gathers over dense vegetation, and narrow paths disappear into terrain that once offered refuge to the last independent rulers of the Inca world. Somewhere within this rugged region lies the memory of Vilcabamba. The name itself became one of archaeology's most persistent mysteries. For decades, explorers searched for the city where the surviving Inca state continued its resistance against Spanish rule. After the fall of Cusco, Manco Inca retreated into the mountains and established a smaller Neo-Inca state. Its rulers maintained independence for decades, until the Spanish finally conquered Vilcabamba in 1572. But the problem was simple. Where exactly was Vilcabamba? The mountains offered no easy answer. Dense vegetation concealed structures. Rivers cut through steep valleys. Ancient pathways vanished beneath forest growth. And Spanish accounts, although valuable, did not provide a straightforward archaeological map. The result was a legend that attracted explorers for generations. One of the most famous episodes came in 1911, when Hiram Bingham traveled through the Andes searching for the last Inca refuge. He encountered Machu Picchu and initially believed he had found Vilcabamba. Later, research demonstrated that Machu Picchu was not the final Neo-Inca capital, but the mistaken identification helped create one of the most enduring archaeological stories of the 20th century. Yet, the real Vilcabamba was not a fantasy. It existed. Spanish forces eventually reached it. Its final ruler, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed in 1572. The mystery concerns the landscape that survived afterward. What happened to the buildings? Which structures belonged to the final Inca state? Which ruins were older? And how much of the settlement still lies concealed beneath vegetation and soil? This is where the broader Vilcabamba archaeological landscape becomes particularly fascinating. The region contains numerous stone complexes, agricultural terraces, pathways, ceremonial spaces, and settlements scattered across difficult terrain. Some are associated with the Inca period, while others preserve evidence of earlier occupation. The mountains themselves become part of the archaeological problem. A site does not exist in isolation here. A stone building may connect to a terrace. A terrace may connect to a trail. A trail may lead toward another settlement. A water channel may reveal how an entire community adapted to its environment. The landscape becomes a network rather than a collection of ruins, and among the most intriguing elements are the stone constructions themselves. Inca builders were capable of remarkable masonry. They could shape stones with great precision, fit blocks tightly together, and integrate architecture with steep mountain terrain. But the remote settlements of Vilcabamba do not always display the monumental character associated with Cusco or Machu Picchu. That difference may be meaningful. The final Inca state was not building under the same conditions as the empire at its height. Its rulers were operating under pressure. They had lost much of their territory. They were surrounded by hostile forces. They needed defensible locations and access to food, water, and communication routes. The architecture of survival could therefore look different from the architecture of imperial display. A settlement hidden within mountains did not need to impress an empire. It needed to endure. This may help explain why the Vilcabamba region is so difficult to interpret. Some structures could have served residential purposes. Others may have been agricultural. Others ceremonial. Still others may have had military or administrative functions. The boundaries between these categories are not always clear. A building used by an elite family could also function as a political meeting place. A ceremonial location could also mark an important route. A fortified position could protect agricultural resources. Ancient settlements rarely followed modern architectural categories. And then there is the question of the stone itself. Why build in such remote locations? One conventional explanation is strategic geography. The mountains offered natural protection. Steep slopes restricted movement. Dense forests made large-scale military operations difficult. Narrow passes could be monitored. High ridges provided views across valleys. The same features that make the region challenging for modern travelers would have made it an effective refuge for a political community under pressure. But geography alone may not explain the cultural importance of these locations. The Inca understood mountains not simply as physical obstacles. Mountains could hold profound religious significance. Certain peaks were regarded as sacred beings or powerful entities, and the surrounding landscape could be organized according to relationships between mountains, water, settlements, and celestial events. This means that a stone complex in Vilcabamba might have had practical and sacred dimensions simultaneously. Its location could be strategically useful because it was also religiously meaningful. Its water source could sustain inhabitants while also carrying ritual importance. Its orientation could serve practical purposes while reflecting a sacred conception of space. The modern observer sees stone. The ancient inhabitant may have seen a living landscape. That difference is crucial. It also explains why some interpretations of Vilcabamba have moved beyond conventional archaeology. Over the years, explorers and writers have proposed that hidden settlements in the region may contain secret chambers, undiscovered royal residences, or structures deliberately concealed from outsiders. Some theories suggest that the final Inca rulers may have hidden valuable objects before the Spanish arrived. Others imagine that undiscovered ceremonial spaces could remain beneath the forest. These possibilities cannot simply be accepted because the terrain is remote. There is no guarantee that dramatic discoveries remain hidden in every unexplored valley. Yet, the region is genuinely difficult to investigate. Dense vegetation can conceal low walls. Landslides can bury structures. Roots can disrupt archaeological layers. Steep terrain can make systematic excavation extremely difficult. Even identifying the boundaries of a settlement may require modern survey technologies. So, when we speak of lost structures in Vilcabamba, the word does not necessarily imply a legendary city waiting intact beneath the jungle. Sometimes, a lost site is simply one whose remains have become difficult to recognize. A wall collapses. Plants grow over it. Soil accumulates. The stones become part of the mountain. Centuries later, the settlement appears to have vanished, but the most important mystery may concern the relationship between the known ruins and the final Neo-Inca state. Spanish chroniclers described Vilcabamba as a functioning political center. There were rulers, there were soldiers, there were agricultural resources, there were religious practices, there were settlements and roads connecting different parts of the territory. Yet, archaeological evidence from the region can be difficult to connect directly with individual events described in colonial accounts. This creates a gap between written history and physical remains. A chronicler may describe a royal residence. Archaeologists may discover a stone structure. But how can we prove that they are the same place? A building may fit the description. Its location may appear plausible. Its date may be appropriate. But certainty requires multiple lines of evidence. This was one of the difficulties that surrounded the search for Vilcabamba. The landscape offered possibilities, but possibilities were not enough. Machu Picchu provides a powerful example. Bingham's initial interpretation seemed convincing to him, particularly because he was searching for a lost Inca refuge and encountered an extraordinary mountain settlement. But later, evidence demonstrated that the identification was incorrect. Even his interpretation of the skeletal remains at Machu Picchu was eventually overturned by modern analysis. The lesson is important. A spectacular ruin can encourage a spectacular explanation, but archaeology advances by testing those explanations. The real Vilcabamba was eventually identified elsewhere, and the distinction between the famous mountain citadel and the final Neo-Inca capital became clearer. Still, uncertainty remains across the wider region. Perhaps that is because Vilcabamba was never a single, isolated complex. It may have consisted of multiple settlements functioning together, a political center, agricultural terraces, military positions, religious sites, storage facilities, roads, water systems, and smaller communities supporting the whole structure. If so, searching for the lost city may create the wrong expectation. The final Inca state could have been a landscape of interconnected places rather than a single monumental city. This possibility changes how we interpret the stone complexes. A small structure might appear insignificant when viewed alone, but if it controlled a route between two settlements, its importance becomes much greater. A terrace may seem ordinary until its scale reveals that it supported a substantial population. A ceremonial platform may seem isolated until its alignment with mountains and pathways becomes clear. Archaeology is therefore increasingly concerned not only with monuments, but with relationships. Where did people live? How did they move? Where did food come from? How was water distributed? Which places were sacred? Which locations were defended? And how did information travel across a mountainous region during a time of political crisis? The answers could transform our understanding of the final Inca resistance. There is also something haunting about the timing. The Neo-Inca state survived for roughly 3 decades after the Spanish conquest of Cusco. That means generations were born into a world in which resistance had become normal. Children grew up knowing that the empire had fallen. Adults remembered earlier political structures. Leaders had to balance warfare, agriculture, diplomacy, and survival. And all of this occurred within a landscape that could hide communities from outsiders. The mountains became both refuge and prison. They protected the inhabitants, but they also isolated them. When the Spanish finally reached Vilcabamba in 1572, the political experiment ended. The city was destroyed, its inhabitants were dispersed, and the landscape began another chapter. Some buildings were abandoned, others were reused. Paths became less traveled. Vegetation returned. The physical evidence of the final Inca state became increasingly difficult to distinguish from the remains of earlier periods. Centuries later, explorers entered the region carrying maps, historical accounts, and theories. Some found ruins, some found trails, some found fragments, and some found nothing at all. This pattern created the mythology of the hidden Andes. But the most compelling mysteries do not require imagining impossible civilizations. The genuine mystery is already remarkable. How did a defeated empire create a functioning political refuge in one of the most difficult landscapes in South America? How were its settlements connected? What happened to its people after the final conquest? And how much of their world remains concealed beneath the forests of Vilcabamba? Modern archaeology may eventually answer some of these questions through remote sensing, systematic survey, excavation, and improved dating techniques. A newly identified wall could change the map. A buried structure could clarify a settlement's function. An inscription could connect a physical site with a historical individual. A new environmental study could reveal how agriculture sustained communities in the mountains. And yet, there is always another possibility. The evidence may be fragmented beyond recovery. Some buildings may have collapsed into valleys. Some objects may have been removed. Some records may never have existed. Some memories may have disappeared with the people who carried them. That is the strange power of the Vilcabamba landscape. It contains history that is simultaneously documented and elusive. We know the final Inca state existed. We know where its last capital was destroyed. We know that communities survived there after the fall of Cusco. We know that the mountains contain extensive archaeological remains. But connecting every stone to the story remains a much harder task. And perhaps somewhere beyond the paths most travelers follow, another structure still lies beneath vegetation. A courtyard, a ceremonial platform, a residence, or a forgotten section of road. It may not reveal a mythical treasure. It may reveal something more valuable, a name, a date, a clue to who lived there, a detail about how the last independent Inca rulers organized their world. For now, the mountains remain quiet. Stone terraces disappear into vegetation. Old pathways fade into slopes. Ruins emerge briefly through the forest before disappearing again. And the question that once drew explorers into these mountains still lingers. How much of the final Inca world have we truly recovered? And how much of the story is still concealed within the stone, waiting for someone to recognize what they are looking at? From the stone strongholds of Vilcabamba, where the final defenders of an empire sought protection among formidable mountains, our journey now moves into an environment almost opposite in character. Here, there are no towering green ridges or hidden valleys. Instead, the land stretches outward beneath an immense sky, a realm of gravel plains, shifting dunes, bitter winters, and distances so vast that a structure can disappear from human memory simply because no one remains to point toward it. This is the Gobi Desert. And somewhere within this enormous landscape lies the inspiration for one of the more elusive stories associated with the region. A supposed lost city known in some retellings as the Dragon's Lair. There is an important distinction to make at the beginning. No archaeological site officially recognized as the lost city of the Dragon's Lair has been established in the Gobi. The name belongs more to legend, modern storytelling, and speculative descriptions than to a securely identified ancient settlement. But that does not mean the underlying mystery is entirely imaginary. The Gobi really has concealed lost settlements. It really has preserved abandoned cities beneath sand. And one of the most remarkable examples is Karakoto, the ancient Black City, a major settlement in the Gobi region of what is now Inner Mongolia. Its remains were rediscovered by modern explorers in the early 20th century, revealing manuscripts, paintings, Buddhist objects, household artifacts, and evidence of a once thriving center connected to long-distance trade. So, perhaps the fascination with the hidden city beneath the Gobi begins with something very real. The desert has already proven that it can erase a city. The question is whether it has erased others. The first impression of the Gobi is deceptive. It is tempting to imagine an empty wilderness, a place incapable of sustaining substantial communities. Yet, the ancient history of Central Asia tells a more complicated story. Water changes everything. A river valley can transform an otherwise severe environment into a corridor of agriculture and commerce. An oasis can become a settlement. A seasonal water source can determine the route of travelers. And a city positioned beside such a resource can flourish for generations before environmental change, political upheaval, or warfare brings its prosperity to an end. Karakoto provides an extraordinary example. The city developed near the Aegean River and became an important center of trade. Its location allowed it to participate in networks connecting distant regions of Asia. The desert surrounding it did not isolate the city completely. In some ways, the desert helped protect it. Once the city was abandoned, the same environment that made life difficult also helped preserve what remained. Sand accumulated around walls. Dry conditions protected manuscripts and organic materials that would have disappeared more rapidly in wetter environments. Objects were left in places where later archaeologists could eventually recover them. The desert became both destroyer and guardian, and this is where the legend of hidden cities becomes more interesting. A city does not need to sink beneath an ocean to become lost. It can simply disappear beneath its environment. A wall collapses. A roof falls. Wind carries dust against the foundations. Dunes migrate. Vegetation changes. Roots shift. A river changes course. People move away. After several centuries, the place can become almost indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. Imagine standing there long after the inhabitants have gone. The city is no longer a city. It is a series of shapes beneath the sand. Perhaps a wall remains visible after a storm. Perhaps a fragment of pottery emerges from the ground. Perhaps a buried foundation creates a slight rise that appears completely natural. Without knowledge of what once stood there, a traveler could walk past without realizing anything is present. That possibility is entirely plausible. But it is important not to transform plausibility into evidence. There is currently no established archaeological evidence for a gigantic underground city known specifically as the Dragon's Lair. That distinction matters because the Gobi has attracted many stories in which mysterious ruins are enlarged by imagination. Some accounts describe enormous subterranean chambers. Others suggest hidden royal treasures. Some versions connect lost settlements with legendary rulers or dragons. These ideas are difficult to test unless they are tied to identifiable archaeological evidence. Still, the landscape itself provides reasons why such stories persist. The Gobi is enormous. It covers roughly 1.3 million square kilometers, and its conditions range from extremely cold winters to hot summers, with very low precipitation in many areas. Exploration has never been simple. A modern satellite can scan vast areas in minutes, but identifying archaeological remains is another matter. A buried settlement does not necessarily produce a dramatic outline. Stone walls may blend into rocky terrain. Mud brick structures can erode into the same colors as the surrounding earth. Sand can cover foundations, and archaeological interpretation requires more than simply finding an unusual shape. A rectangular pattern on an aerial image may be a building. It may also be a geological formation. It may be an old irrigation feature. It may be a modern disturbance. Or it may be something archaeologists have not yet understood. This problem has appeared repeatedly in the search for lost cities around the world. The human mind is exceptionally good at recognizing patterns. Sometimes that ability leads to discovery. Sometimes it creates a mystery where there is only geology. The Gobi offers countless opportunities for both. Yet, beneath the speculation lies a genuine archaeological landscape filled with unanswered questions. Karakoto is perhaps the clearest warning against assuming that a lost city must be fictional. When Pyotr Kozlov's expedition reached the ruins in 1908, explorers encountered the remains of a substantial, fortified settlement rising from the desert. Archaeological work subsequently recovered manuscripts, legal documents, inventories, paintings, Buddhist material, and everyday objects. These discoveries transformed the ruins from an isolated collection of walls into evidence of a sophisticated urban society. The city had been real. Its prosperity had been real. Its disappearance had been real, and for centuries its remains had waited. That raises an intriguing possibility. If one major city could become forgotten, could smaller settlements have suffered the same fate? The answer is almost certainly yes. The Gobi was crossed by travelers, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and migrating communities for centuries. Not every settlement would have been monumental. Some may have consisted of modest compounds, agricultural villages, military stations, religious sites, or trading posts. Many could have disappeared without leaving a recognizable skyline. This is where the concept of the Dragon's Lair can be approached cautiously. Rather than imagining an enormous subterranean metropolis, perhaps the legend reflects a distorted memory of a real archaeological phenomenon. A settlement partly buried by sand. A fortress surrounded by barren terrain. A complex of chambers whose original function was forgotten. A ruined city whose architecture appeared unnatural to later observers. Over time, a place like that could acquire a dramatic name. The dragon, in such a story, might symbolize the landscape itself. Power, danger, isolation. Something ancient guarding what remains. But there is no evidence that an actual dragon cult or dragon-shaped civilization existed beneath the Gobi. The more interesting question is why the dragon motif feels so appropriate. Across many Asian traditions, dragons have been associated with water, weather, authority, and supernatural power. In an environment where water determines survival, a legendary creature associated with water would carry particular symbolic force. Could stories of a hidden guardian have emerged around a lost settlement near an ancient river? Possibly. But this remains speculation. Archaeology cannot turn a compelling story into historical fact simply because the landscape seems to fit. What archaeology can do is investigate the physical evidence. And the physical evidence from the Gobi continues to reveal how dynamic this environment once was. Today, some areas appear almost lifeless, but ancient settlements depended on rivers, groundwater, springs, and irrigation. When those systems changed, settlements could become vulnerable. A city might survive a political crisis but fail after losing access to water. A trading center might decline when commercial routes shifted. A fortified settlement might become irrelevant after a new political power controlled the region. The disappearance of a city, therefore, does not always require catastrophe. Sometimes history simply moves around it. A river changes, a road moves, a new capital rises. Merchants choose another route. The old city becomes unnecessary. Eventually, people leave. Then the desert takes over. This may be one explanation for the fate of several settlements associated with the wider Silk Road world. But some disappearances were more violent. Karakoto, for example, is traditionally associated with conflict during the 14th century, including a siege in which its water supply was cut. The city was subsequently abandoned, and its remains were gradually engulfed by the desert. That detail is unsettling. Water was the city's lifeline. Cut the water, and the city could no longer function. In a desert environment, geography and warfare become inseparable. A wall may protect inhabitants from soldiers, but it cannot protect them indefinitely from thirst. Perhaps this is why some ancient desert strongholds appear so imposing. Their walls were not merely barriers. They represented the desperate importance of controlling resources. And this brings us back to the imagined dragon's lair. If a hidden settlement really existed somewhere within the Gobi, what would we expect to find? Not necessarily towers covered in gold. Not an underground palace filled with impossible machinery. More likely, we would find practical evidence. Storage facilities, ceramics, animal remains, tools, burial areas, irrigation channels, roads, walls, fragments of writing, perhaps traces of imported goods revealing connections with distant regions. Those are the clues that turn a legend into archaeology. A single inscription can be more powerful than 100 dramatic stories. A sealed room containing ordinary household objects can tell us more about a vanished population than an imagined treasure chamber. And an irrigation canal can reveal that an apparently barren landscape once supported a community. The challenge is that the Gobi constantly alters the evidence. Sand moves. Wind erodes exposed surfaces. Seasonal changes affect visibility. Archaeological remains can become partially buried and later exposed again. A site may appear, disappear, and reappear in a different form. This gives the landscape an almost deceptive quality. The desert does not simply hide things. It rearranges the clues. A structure buried for centuries can suddenly emerge. Another can disappear. A path that once connected settlements can become invisible. The map of the ancient world is therefore not fixed. It is something archaeologists must reconstruct from fragments. Modern technologies may help. Satellite imagery can reveal subtle patterns. Remote sensing can identify buried features. Geophysical surveys can detect structures without immediately excavating them. Environmental studies can reconstruct ancient water systems, and improved dating methods can determine when different phases of occupation occurred. Each technique narrows the field. But none can guarantee a spectacular discovery. That may be the most important lesson. The Gobi does not need a mythical underground kingdom to be extraordinary. Its documented archaeology is already remarkable. It contains cities that once supported trade across vast distances. It contains manuscripts that survived centuries of abandonment. It contains monuments whose original meanings are still being reconstructed. And it contains landscapes in which human settlement depended upon forces that could change without warning. Still, the possibility of undiscovered sites remains. The Gobi is too large and archaeologically complex to assume that every ancient settlement has been identified. Perhaps another ruined trading post lies beneath a dune field. Perhaps an isolated fortress remains hidden beyond a modern route. Perhaps an ancient cemetery waits beneath layers of sediment. Perhaps somewhere near an extinct watercourse, the foundations of a settlement survive. And perhaps one of those discoveries could eventually explain how a particular legend began. But the dragon's lair itself remains unconfirmed. No verified excavation has revealed a lost city carrying that name. From the shifting sands of the Gobi, where abandoned settlements can disappear beneath an unforgiving landscape, our journey now returns to the Nile Valley, a land where ancient cities were not merely built, but repeatedly buried, rebuilt, abandoned, and remembered through fragments. Among Egypt's most enduring archaeological legends is the story of a city whose streets were filled with gold, whose wealth seemed almost beyond imagination, and whose disappearance left behind one of history's most persistent questions. The city is sometimes described as a lost, golden city. But behind the legend lies a complicated mixture of archaeological discovery, ancient wealth, royal power, and later storytelling. Egypt's ancient civilization produced extraordinary quantities of gold. The deserts east of the Nile contained rich deposits, and gold became deeply connected with royal authority, religious symbolism, and funerary traditions. Pharaohs were surrounded by objects made from the precious metal, while temples and tombs could contain elaborate golden treasures. To the ancient Egyptians, gold was more than wealth. It was associated with permanence, with divinity, with the sun, and with the eternal nature of the gods. That symbolism helps explain why stories of a golden Egyptian city have remained so powerful. But was there ever a city literally overflowing with gold? Archaeology provides a more complicated answer. One of the most important discoveries related to this legend came in 2020, when archaeologists announced the discovery of a large ancient settlement near Luxor, not far from the monuments associated with the reign of Amenhotep III. The site became widely known as the Lost Golden City. Its formal archaeological identification is the ancient settlement of Aten, believed to have been established during the reign of Amenhotep III in the 14th century BC and later occupied during the reign of Akhenaten. What made the discovery remarkable was not a mountain of treasure. It was something more revealing. A city. Walls, houses, workshops, storage areas, tools, ceramics, and evidence of organized daily life. The discovery offered archaeologists an unusually detailed glimpse into urban life during one of the most transformative periods of ancient Egyptian history. The settlement was not simply a royal palace covered in gold. It was a functioning community. Workers lived there. Craftspeople produced goods. Food was prepared. Objects were stored. Administrative activities took place. The physical remains suggested that the settlement was closely connected with royal activity. And yet, its eventual abandonment remains fascinating. Why was a functioning settlement left behind? The answer may be connected with one of the most extraordinary transitions in Egyptian history. Amenhotep III was succeeded by his son, Akhenaten. Akhenaten radically altered Egypt's religious and political landscape. He promoted the worship of the Aten, represented by the solar disk, and established a new royal capital farther north at Akhetaten, modern Amarna. Suddenly, the center of royal power shifted. Workers, administrators, priests, and others connected with the royal court were drawn toward the new capital. Aten may have gradually lost its importance. The city did not necessarily vanish in a single catastrophic event. It may simply have become unnecessary. This distinction matters. When people imagine a lost city, they often picture destruction, a sudden disaster, an invasion, or some terrible curse. But archaeology frequently reveals something quieter. Cities disappear because people leave. Political priorities change. Trade routes move. Water systems decline. New capitals are established. Old centers become inconvenient. The buildings remain, but the population moves elsewhere. Aten may represent precisely this kind of disappearance. Yet, the circumstances surrounding its abandonment have encouraged more speculative interpretations. Could the city have been deliberately erased because it was associated with a controversial royal period? Could later rulers have wanted to distance themselves from Akhenaten's religious revolution? Could the settlement have been neglected because the royal administration moved to another center? These possibilities exist within the broader historical context, but the evidence does not support a simple story of deliberate destruction or supernatural punishment. The curse element belongs more to the mythology that has grown around ancient Egypt than to the archaeological evidence itself. Still, curses have a long history in Egyptian imagination. Tombs sometimes contained warnings intended to discourage disturbance. Ancient Egyptians took the protection of the dead seriously. A burial place was not merely a storage chamber for a body. It was part of a complex religious system concerned with survival after death. This makes the modern concept of an Egyptian curse particularly intriguing. When archaeologists enter a sealed tomb, they are entering a space deliberately separated from ordinary life. The psychological effect can be powerful. Dark corridors, ancient inscriptions, objects untouched for thousands of years, human remains, and the knowledge that the people who created the tomb expected it to remain protected long after their deaths. It is easy to understand how later generations transformed such places into stories of supernatural danger. But the lost Golden City presents a different kind of mystery. There was no need for a curse to explain its disappearance. History itself may have been enough. The city belonged to a political system that changed. Its royal patrons disappeared, its religious environment transformed, and its population eventually moved elsewhere. What remained was architecture waiting beneath the soil. Then, thousands of years later, archaeologists began uncovering it. The discovery revealed something that treasure hunters could never provide: context. A golden object tells us that gold existed. A workshop tells us who may have produced it. A storage area tells us how goods were organized. A residential structure reveals how people lived. A road or boundary shows how the settlement was arranged. Together, these fragments reconstruct a society. And this is where the lost Golden City becomes more mysterious than its name suggests. The real treasure may not be gold. It may be information. The settlement offers evidence about the period surrounding Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, a time when Egypt experienced dramatic religious and political change. Akhenaten's reign remains particularly fascinating because his reforms disrupted established religious traditions and eventually failed to survive intact after his death. His capital at Amarna was abandoned. His religious reforms were reversed. His memory was later treated very differently from that of more conventional pharaohs. Could the disappearance of Aten be part of this broader transformation? Perhaps, but archaeological evidence must be separated from later assumptions. A settlement associated with a particular king does not automatically become a victim of political erasure. The abandonment could have resulted from ordinary administrative changes. Perhaps the workforce moved with the royal court. Perhaps the settlement was no longer needed. Perhaps its functions were absorbed elsewhere. Or perhaps several factors combined. There is also the possibility that additional sections of the settlement remain undiscovered. Ancient cities rarely end precisely where modern excavation stops. Walls may continue beneath surrounding fields. Workshops may lie outside the currently excavated areas. Burial grounds may remain hidden. Roads may connect the settlement with other ancient centers. And unexplored layers could potentially reveal more about the people who lived there. That is where the real mystery remains. Not whether the city was magically cursed, but what happened to its inhabitants. Where did they go? Did they carry memories of the settlement into other communities? Did craftsmen continue their work elsewhere? Did families preserve traditions connected with the royal city? And how quickly did the abandoned buildings disappear beneath the landscape? For thousands of years, no one could answer. The city remained silent. Its walls waited beneath the earth. Then archaeology brought it back into view. The Golden City was never simply a place of unimaginable treasure. It was a place of workers, administrators, craftspeople, households, and royal ambitions. Its greatest value lies in what it reveals about a civilization undergoing profound change. And yet the name remains strangely appropriate. Gold helped define the power of ancient Egypt. Gold was associated with the sun and eternity. And now, after centuries beneath the soil, the remains of a settlement connected with one of Egypt's most remarkable royal periods have returned to the light. Perhaps that is the real irony. The city was lost. Its people disappeared. Its political world collapsed. But the evidence survived. And somewhere beneath the surrounding landscape, there may still be structures capable of changing what we understand about the settlement, its inhabitants, and the turbulent years surrounding the reigns of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. If more of the city emerges, will it finally explain why the settlement was abandoned? Or will the ruins only deepen the mystery of what happened when Egypt's royal world suddenly changed? The answer may still be waiting beneath the earth, sealed not by a curse, but by time itself. From the buried streets of Egypt's ancient settlement, where a forgotten community resurfaced after more than 3,000 years beneath the earth, our journey now moves westward across the Mediterranean to the rugged island of Corsica. Here, among dense woodland and granite outcrops, an ancient stronghold appears almost fused with the landscape itself. This is Cucuruzzu. At first, the site seems less like a fortress than a natural formation. Massive blocks of granite rise between trees and patches of moss, their surfaces softened by weather and time. But as the path continues, the stones begin to reveal deliberate shapes. Walls, corridors, chambers, stairways, and defensive structures built into the rugged terrain. Cucuruzzu is part of the extraordinary prehistoric archaeological heritage of southern Corsica. The complex is associated primarily with the Taurian culture, a Bronze Age tradition that flourished on the island during the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. Its builders left behind structures known as tori, large stone towers or fortified monuments that have often been compared with the better-known nuraghi of Sardinia. But comparison can only take us so far. Cucuruzzu has its own character. Its architecture follows the contours of the granite landscape rather than attempting to erase them. Stones are incorporated into natural formations. Passages wind between massive rocks. Defensive walls appear to grow from the ground. Was this simply practical construction? Or did the landscape itself hold significance for the people who built here? That question follows us through almost every part of the complex. The most conventional interpretation is that Cucuruzzu served as a fortified settlement or defensive center. The elevated terrain provided natural protection, while the stone structures created additional barriers. For a prehistoric community, such advantages would have been considerable. A strong position could protect inhabitants from attack. It could shelter valuable resources. It could provide a place for storing food, and it could offer a commanding view of approaches through the surrounding region. But a fortress requires more than walls. It requires people. Who lived here? How large was the community? Were the structures permanently occupied, or did their use change according to circumstances? Archaeological evidence suggests that Cucuruzzu was not simply an isolated tower. The complex was part of a broader settlement landscape, with architectural features indicating domestic and communal activity. That makes the site more interesting. A solitary defensive monument tells us something about conflict. A fortified settlement tells us about society. People had to organize themselves. Food had to be obtained and stored. Tools had to be produced. Water had to be accessed. Buildings had to be maintained. Someone had to decide how labor would be distributed. And somewhere within that system were beliefs about territory, authority, ancestors, and the natural world. The stones reveal the structure. They do not reveal the entire society behind it. Cucuruzzu's most remarkable feature may be the way architecture and geology appear to merge. Granite dominates the region, forming massive natural blocks and rugged surfaces. The builders did not need to transport every stone from distant quarries. Instead, they could work with the terrain itself. Walls could follow natural contours. Existing rock formations could become part of defenses. Openings between boulders could become passages. The distinction between natural and artificial becomes surprisingly difficult to see. Imagine approaching the site thousands of years ago. You would not necessarily see a conventional fortress standing apart from its environment. You might see the mountain itself transformed into a settlement. Perhaps that was deliberate. Perhaps the builders recognized that the strongest architecture was already present in the landscape. There is another possibility. The unusual integration of stone and terrain may have had symbolic meaning. Prehistoric communities across Europe sometimes placed monuments in prominent natural settings. Mountains, caves, springs, cliffs, and unusual rock formations could become meaningful locations. But there is no simple way to determine whether a particular granite outcrop at Cucuruzzu was sacred. Archaeology can identify human activity. It can identify construction. It can sometimes identify ritual deposits. But it cannot automatically reconstruct the emotions people attach to a landscape. This uncertainty has encouraged more speculative interpretations of prehistoric Corsica. Some have imagined that the Tori were not merely defensive structures but ceremonial centers connected with astronomy, seasonal observation, or ancestral traditions. Such ideas are intriguing, especially because prehistoric societies were often deeply dependent upon cycles of sunlight, rainfall, agriculture, and seasonal change. Yet evidence must come first. A structure facing a particular direction does not automatically prove astronomical intent. A circular chamber does not necessarily represent a celestial symbol, and an elevated position does not automatically indicate a sacred function. The most cautious interpretation is that Cucuruzzu probably served several purposes over time: defensive, residential, economic, possibly ceremonial. Ancient buildings were not required to have only one function. A secure structure could also become a meeting place. A storage room could be part of a household. A fortified settlement could become a symbolic center of local authority. This becomes particularly important when considering the wider Bronze Age Mediterranean. Corsica was not isolated from the rest of the prehistoric world. The Mediterranean connected communities across enormous distances. People moved. Materials circulated. Ideas traveled. Metals, ceramics, tools, and other goods could pass between regions through networks that existed long before written records described them. Corsica's position within the western Mediterranean placed it within this larger environment. The island's prehistoric inhabitants were therefore not living in complete isolation. They were part of a world of exchange and competition. Perhaps Cucuruzzu's defensive character reflects a period when controlling resources and territory became increasingly important. Perhaps the stronghold protected a community involved in local trade. Perhaps rival groups competed over fertile land or access to strategic routes. Or perhaps the walls represented status as much as security. A powerful community might build monumental architecture not because an attack was imminent, but because the structure demonstrated that its inhabitants possessed the resources and organization to construct it. A fortress can be a weapon without ever being attacked. Its existence sends a message. This place belongs to someone. The people here can defend themselves, and the stones will remind others of that fact. Yet time eventually weakened that message. Cucuruzzu was abandoned, altered, or transformed through periods that remain difficult to reconstruct in complete detail. Later inhabitants encountered the ruins. Some structures were reused, others deteriorated. Vegetation slowly reclaimed the site. The forest became part of the monument. This is perhaps why Cucuruzzu feels so different from the monumental ruins of open landscapes. The site does not dominate its surroundings. It disappears into them. A wall can be hidden behind trees. A chamber can resemble a natural cavity. A pathway can become indistinguishable from a trail. The forest does not merely surround the archaeological remains. It helps conceal them. And that raises a broader question. How many prehistoric structures in Corsica remain unrecognized because their architecture has become part of the landscape? Archaeologists have documented many sites, but prehistoric settlement was not necessarily confined to the monumental remains we can easily identify. Smaller dwellings may have left only subtle traces. Wooden structures may have disappeared completely. Agricultural areas may have been transformed by later activity. Stone features may be buried beneath soil. The surviving monuments could therefore represent only the visible fragments of a much larger world. Cucuruzzu gives us a glimpse of that world. Its massive stones suggest collective labor. Its defensive character suggests concern with security. Its settlement remains suggest domestic life. Its position within the landscape suggests careful selection, but the people themselves remain almost completely anonymous. We do not know the names of the builders. We cannot hear their language. We cannot reconstruct every ritual performed here. We do not know what stories they told about the granite formations surrounding their homes. And we cannot be certain why this particular place became important enough to transform. Perhaps the answer was practical. Perhaps the rocks offered shelter. Perhaps the location controlled movement through the region. Perhaps several generations gradually expanded the complex. Or perhaps Cucuruzzu represented something more profound, a place where community, landscape, memory, and defense became inseparable. Today, the forest has returned almost completely to the stones. Roots wind around ancient masonry. Moss covers surfaces once shaped by human hands. Sunlight moves through the trees and briefly illuminates chambers that have been dark for centuries. The stronghold no longer guards anyone, yet it still preserves the outline of a society that understood how to turn raw granite into architecture. And perhaps somewhere beneath the forest floor, additional traces remain: buried floors, discarded tools, forgotten storage areas, or evidence of activities that could change our understanding of the complex. From the granite stronghold of Cucuruzzu, where prehistoric builders shaped their settlement around the natural contours of the island, our journey now crosses the sea to another remote corner of the ancient Atlantic world. On the northern coast of Anglesey, Wales, low stone walls rest quietly among fields and windswept grass. At first, they seem almost ordinary, but these ruins once formed a carefully organized settlement. This is Lligwy. Hidden near the coast, the site preserves the remains of an ancient enclosed settlement, whose surviving structures offer an unusually intimate glimpse into life in Roman period Britain. Unlike a monumental palace or imposing fortress, Lligwy is intriguing precisely because it appears domestic. There are houses, there are working spaces, there are thick walls, and there are traces of an everyday community whose inhabitants left behind far more questions than names. The settlement is generally associated with the later Roman period, although its history appears to extend beyond a single moment. Archaeological evidence suggests occupation from around the Roman era into the centuries that followed, placing Lligwy within a period when Britain was undergoing profound political and cultural change. Rome had established control over much of Britain. But Roman Britain was never simply Rome transplanted into another landscape. Local traditions survived, communities adapted, trade connected settlements, and when Roman authority eventually weakened, life did not simply stop. Lligwy offers a small window into that complicated world. The first impression is one of enclosure. Large stones form substantial walls around the settlement, creating a defined interior space. Within it are the remains of several buildings, including structures interpreted as houses and working areas. Why was so much effort invested in enclosing this particular community? The obvious answer is security. An enclosed settlement could provide protection for people, animals, tools, and stored goods. But walls can communicate more than fear. They can establish boundaries. They can define community identity. They can separate private space from the outside world. And they can demonstrate that the people living inside possessed enough resources and organization to construct them. The stones, therefore, tell us something about society even before we understand exactly how every building was used. Among the most intriguing features at Lligwy is the presence of a substantial circular structure. Traditionally interpreted as a house or domestic building, its thick stone walls would have provided stability and protection from the harsh coastal climate. Inside, life would have been remarkably different from the quiet ruins visible today. There would have been movement, smoke, food preparation, conversation, animals, tools, perhaps children moving between buildings while adults worked nearby. This is the aspect of Lligwy that makes it so valuable. It brings archaeology away from kings and monuments and toward ordinary people. What did they eat? How did they earn their living? Where did their materials come from? Who controlled the settlement? And how closely were they connected to the Roman economy? Artifacts recovered from the site provide some clues. Pottery and other objects indicate that its inhabitants participated in wider networks, rather than living completely isolated from the outside world. Imported or Roman-influenced materials suggest contact with the broader economic system that existed across Britain. But cultural contact does not necessarily mean cultural replacement. The inhabitants could adopt Roman goods while maintaining local customs. They could use imported pottery while speaking local languages. They could participate in trade while preserving older traditions. Lligwy therefore belongs to a much more complicated story than the simple contrast between Roman and native. It represents adaptation, and adaptation can be difficult to see archaeologically. A ceramic vessel survives, a wall survives, a metal object survives, but the choices behind those objects are harder to reconstruct. Why did someone purchase a particular vessel? Why was a building constructed in one shape rather than another? Why was the settlement enclosed? What did its inhabitants think of the Roman presence across Britain? Were they Romanized elites, local farmers, craft workers, traders, or a mixture of different social groups? The answers may have changed over generations. The settlement itself appears to have been involved in agricultural and craft activities. Archaeological evidence indicates metalworking and other forms of production, suggesting that Lligwy was not simply a collection of houses. People were making things here, working materials, processing resources, maintaining an economy. This raises another question. Was Lligwy a small rural settlement serving its own inhabitants, or did it play a wider role in the surrounding region? Its location on Anglesey is significant. The island was agriculturally productive and strategically important, and its relationship with Roman Britain was complicated by the military campaigns that brought it under Roman control. Yet, by the later Roman period, the landscape had changed. Military priorities evolved. Trade patterns shifted. Political authority became less certain. Communities had to adapt to changing circumstances. Lligwy may have experienced those changes directly. One of the most interesting aspects of the site is the uncertainty surrounding its final phase. When did people leave? Was the settlement abandoned gradually? Did economic conditions change? Did political instability affect the community? Was there a sudden event? Or did people simply move elsewhere as circumstances evolved? Archaeology rarely provides a single dramatic answer. Abandonment can happen slowly. A house falls out of use. A roof collapses. Another structure is repaired. A workshop stops operating. Families move. A younger generation chooses a different location. Eventually, the settlement becomes quiet. But there are aspects of Lligwy that have encouraged more dramatic interpretations. The substantial walls and evidence of destruction have led some observers to imagine conflict or sudden violence. Such possibilities cannot be dismissed entirely, because Britain experienced periods of political instability before, during, and after Roman rule. But destruction does not automatically mean warfare. Buildings can collapse. Fire can spread accidentally. Materials can be deliberately dismantled. Later inhabitants can alter earlier structures. Archaeology must distinguish between evidence of destruction and evidence of its cause. This is where the mystery becomes particularly interesting. A settlement may preserve the physical evidence of its final days without preserving the explanation. A burned layer can tell us that something burned. It cannot always tell us who started the fire. A collapsed wall can tell us that a structure fell. It cannot necessarily tell us whether an enemy, an earthquake, decay, or deliberate dismantling caused it. Lligwy therefore requires patience. The site has also generated more speculative ideas about its purpose. Could it have been a fortified refuge during a period of instability? Could some structures have had communal or ritual functions? Was there a social hierarchy within the settlement that is no longer visible? These possibilities remain difficult to prove. The safest interpretation is that Lligwy was a substantial enclosed community with domestic, agricultural, and craft activity. But that description still leaves plenty of room for unanswered questions. The settlement may have had a greater regional importance than its surviving remains suggest. Perhaps it served as a local center. Perhaps it was connected with nearby estates or trading networks. Perhaps its inhabitants controlled access to resources that made the location valuable. And perhaps the walls were as much about identity as protection. Imagine standing there nearly 2,000 years ago. The enclosure rises around you. Beyond it lies open countryside and the distant sea. Inside are houses, workshops, animals, stored goods, and people whose lives follow familiar rhythms. The Roman world exists beyond the settlement, but it is not necessarily the center of every decision. Local life continues. Generations pass. Then the political landscape begins to change. Roman authority eventually retreats from Britain. Yet the people living here do not simply disappear. They adapt again. Perhaps Lligwy's later history belongs to this period of transformation, a world in which the structures of Roman Britain were weakening while local communities continued to survive. That possibility makes the site more than a Roman period curiosity. It becomes evidence of continuity. The empire can disappear from the political map while ordinary life continues. Today, the settlement is quiet. Grass grows between the stones. The walls no longer divide a living community. The workshops are silent. The paths have lost their footprints. Yet, the arrangement of the ruins still preserves the outline of a vanished society. And perhaps somewhere beneath the ground, additional evidence remains. A buried floor could reveal another occupation phase. A discarded tool could identify a craft activity. A fragment of pottery could refine the chronology.